Сюда. Рыски что-то не хочет гуляться. А ну появилась новая.
But in the pitch black night, they can't find the
Вас далеко, вообще ничего не понял.
Bob Marcus tries to signal the distant helicopters.
О, окна выбиты, куча мусора. Понятно. Фигня какая-то. Фигня. Чуть делать круто. Мы 116. Это жесть. Опа, ух ты. Это квартира. Квартирный дом, сразу понятно, да. 4-этажный. А где закрывать надо? Открыто, блин. Я помню в клиниче входная. Постоянно закрыта была. Закрывать эту дверь. Пицца. Видно с окна. Крисмас это. Дом. Вау. Чего? Нет. Накрыл. Ну, понятно. Че какая-то развалюха, блин, опять. Понятно. Еще одна, наверное, будет тут это. Стала развалюхи, столбы. Да. Переделывать надо. Да. Хотел его сделать, он... Вот этот. Ресторан. Кафе-ресторан. Он мусор валяется в кафешке, в кафе. Это не за такое. В кафе еще грязно. Это тупая.
In all, 77 people survived the crash. 99 people are killed. By dawn, all the roofs had been gone.
Прикольный ресторан. Кафе-ресторан. 50? Медленный. В легенде у нас столько там расслушал. Да, медленненько, бля.
It's the first ever jumbo jet to crash, and it produces the largest number of deaths in U.S. civil aviation history.
Ой. too bad.
There's tremendous pressure on investigators from the National
That's not too bad.
Safety Board to find out what.
It was
О, да, что? Темнота. Еще сегодня появилась. С утра. Или утром. А и вчера. Ну, это вчера. Вчерашнее. Финиш второе. Да, первое, это вчера. Вчерашнее. Я слышал еще. Я не знал тут долго.
NTSB investigators
8.
documented the final settings for many of the instruments in the cockpit. They
И первый нашел.
was set to maintain an altitude of 2 miles.
Что он тебе попался?
So why did
Начались? А как?
maintenance expert engineer Donadeo was interviewed? All he can tell investigators is the crew was trying to fix a micro for the crash. Within days, the plane's 2 black boxes are recovered.
И когда? Он это был! Я помню его! Было! Он уже готовый. Походу узнал. Был. Уже готовый. Ну, похож. Был уже такой. Фила? Вау!
By the memory of switching seats with Lily just before.
Ну да, блин.
They had swapped seats quite casually earlier during the flight when she
Чья-то.
walked back to the restaurant. She was thrown into the swamp and drowned.
Блин. Это
The swamp proves both a blessing and a curse for survivors. Yes, we still got to walk.
Мне нравится.
You woke up. It's all on you.
Ничего. Отель. Отель опять ищи.
So close survivors' wounds are preventing many from bleeding to death. But there's a deadly
Понятно, ничего нет, только один. Все тут про развалюху.
Contaminated by a deadly organism found in the black mud of the Everglades. The organism produces an infection called
Там шоу.
It can kill a person.
Игра Геймс Шоп. Игровой магазин.
Gas gangrene can only be destroyed in a
Ну, с красоты я вижу знаки. Можно закрутить. Хе-хе. Их видно.
Oxygen gets forced into the wounds and kills the bacteria.
Магазин.
Вот это степь. Chambers last week.
Это с чем домов сделали.
The only other way to save patients is to amputate the
Yeah.
limb. Wrong in
Чего? Мусор нет. На 5 звезд? Посмотрим, интересно. Это там впал.
Unless doctors
Ah,
can
okay.
the chamber soon, Infantino will lose his arm. Doctors search for a chamber for Infantino.
Ух ты.
Investigators examine what's left of the plane.
О,
It's
вот это, блин, доминище, тут второй. Ух и домина. Потом, не знаю, ну огромный. Доминище жесть.
in fact, some
Чего?
in such good condition that the NTSB gives them back to Eastern Airlines so they can be installed on other airplanes in its fleet.
Непонятно.
An unused hydrogen buried chamber is finally found for Ron Infantino at a Navy base in Panama City. The pressurized oxygen kills the bacteria.
Ой, не удалось. А, ну просто есть уже.
3,000 feet without the crew noticing. Investigators know the plane was mechanically sound. They now focus on other possible reasons for the unobserved descent. At the top of the list is subtle incapacitation of the pilot. The autopsy of Captain Bob Locke has yielded a gruesome discovery. Captain Locke had a large, undetected tumor growing in his brain.
Чего?
It pressed into the part of his brain responsible for sight. Medical records reveal that between the ages of 50 and 52, vision in the pilot's left eye had rapidly deteriorated. Doctors believe
Я понял. Тюрьма. Тюремный блок. Тюрьма. Камера, тюрьма.
his attention became focused on the
Ну, да, это тюрьма.
He may have noticed the warnings of the alternative.
Да. Я же догадался.
Investigators consider a stunning possibility.
Мгм.
An undetected medical ailment may have contributed to the
Камеры, тюрьма. Это наблюдение.
Investigators learn what they can about Captain Bob Locke. They interview people who knew him and pore over his medical
Кайс, по-моему.
The investigators heard that
А, медотдетектор.
and of friends had perfect vision. He was an expert marksman. He shot dogs, particularly with very small targets.
Тюрьма.
showed that he'd recently passed a medical in which he was issued a corrected glass
Это
of
нет.
The evidence doesn't support the notion that
Сейчас даже зеленый, да, оно. Нет, это зеленый. Лисик.
Dr. James Elvis, who did the autopsy, told the
Чего?
tested material for control vision.
А, да, тут дело вот надо еще. А, и этаж вот это.
He felt it was
Стена.
to do with the accident.
А и вон еще стена.
investigators still don't know why 401 started descending in the first place.
Тюрьма, это вообще прикольно. Мексикан хаус. Мексиканский дом. О, ой, ё-моё.
They're removed.
Ну, вилла какая-то, блин. Не размеряющий, но... Ты тут, ё-моё. Ё-моё, ого. Вот доминище, блин, жесть. Побыл чья-то, блин. О, жесть, ну здоровый. Чисто в мексиканском стиле. Прикольно.
There's another question.
Класс у него здоровый, жесть, блин.
Why did
А, я помню.
prove that that plane was wrong?
Он был еще раз.
The world's first three-dimensional radar.
Эй, понятно.
Stored there.
Ладно,
It meant that controller Charlie Johnson knew the location, altitude, and speed of Flight 401.
А, да, я его помню. Ой, я понял.
Johnson's conversations and discovered that on the night of the crash, it was another plane.
Принял, вот это ты.
National Airlines Flight 607 was coming into land just ahead of Flight 401.
Ты тупая, ты тупая.
Its own. As he focused on
Who is it?
over to another portfolio.
Я умтул.
But just as National 607 came in for its emergency landing, the other controller
Ах, там это ты.
and flight
О. Да, его надо делать. Да. И число известных, значит, да. Я вот это еще не сделал. Вот этот, вот этот, вот этот, вот этот, вот этот, вот этот и вот этот. Это раз, два, три, четыре, пять, шесть, 7 домов еще. Кафе еще. Кафе еще.
But the controller didn't stop there. This was limited this point. Johnson decided to make Flight 401.
Вот это тоже какой-то раздолбаха. О! Ну! Что это? Это сутопе!
Investigators conclude that at that moment, Controller Johnson was the only one who could see that the plane.
Это ты видел уже вот этот. Этот нет. Вот это, блин. Это строй. Стиловое огорожено. Брат надо будет. 200 этажей, это огромный. Не загрузится, нет. А нет, в Грузии. Нет. Это слишком много домов. Где тут? Какова? То ли высокий какой-то.
That sound if the plane goes 250 feet above or below the selected by the pilots. As investigators replay the tapes of the falls, they clearly hear Avalon sounding in the cockpit when the plane goes through 1,750 feet.
Да, это сделал вот этот. Что, бассейн или что такое, мне интересно? Интересно. Какая-то вышка ты видишь. Вроде как будет для прыжков. Все. Ты же вспомни, чего надо. Опять я помню. Ого, мой. Жесть. Тут на 2. Шипунис. Японский тут дом. Зеленый уже... Да. Надо сделать. Что, дом или что такое? Японцы не будут. Да, не было такого. Новое. Тоже было. Да где-то был... Как ее? Это парк. Да. Интересно. Тоже. Нет. Нет, да. Даже раз лишнее.
Investigators interview a number of pilots and make a startling discovery.
Это какая вот это поешь? Нету. Ну, слабая власть.
They may have become overly dependent on the technical.
Где он, да? Тут я уже был. Понравился, это классный. Классный, но понравился. Какой-то блога было. А, вот этот. Фэшн. А вот такой вот такие вот. Алло? Сделал, не, я сделал этот парк. Из часы.
We're still at 2,000. Hey, what's that?
Ё-моё. Чем мусора.
The answer comes in a dramatic form when the NTSB conducts a public
Виктория. Аус. 1900. О, какого года? Третьего года. Все какой-то очень старый. 1903 года. Виктория Хаус. Это толпа. Где? Ого, вот это дом. Я глянул цифру. Вот толпа. Это толпа.
Gallup tells the hearing that during a recent flight on the TriStar, he had accidentally dropped a map on the cockpit floor. As he bent down to pick it up, he nudged his control column. He noticed immediately
Тут парк появился, не? О, да.
the part of the autopilot controlling altitude had been turned off.
Да, вот это тоже.
The NTSB discovers that Gallup's experience is shared by others.
Территория он маленькая. Мусор.
In fact, 70
На вышке просто сделать.
instantaneized the notice onto a company
3600. Ого!
and also made the seven of its TriStar pilots.
Ё-моё. 3000. Ого, охранную территорию. Где там? Это толпа. Вот это. 1600. Дойдем.
The flight data recorder tells investigators the precise moment that the plane's altitude started to drop. It was 11:37 and 8 seconds. By studying the voice recorder transcript, investigators can tell what was happening in the cockpit at that exact time.
Hey, get down there and see if that damn nose moves.
By turning to speak to the flight engineer, investigators believe that Captain Locke bumped his control wheel. He did it with just enough pressure to disengage that part of the autopilot that had been controlling the plane's altitude. Without anyone realizing it, a simple nudge of the control wheel started a gradual descent. On a dark, moonless night, the pilots had no visual cues to tell them they were falling.
It was determined that occasionally, with just a soft bump, the autopilot had to be disengaged.
Что это за...
Before the crash.
A training
That's
director
it.
eventually revealed
Where?
that before the Everglades crash, pilots were never told
That's it.
that the device could disengage the autopilot. The NTSB comes to a sobering conclusion. The plane crash was due to pilot error. The crew was distracted. They mishandled the plane's sophisticated automation, and they hadn't been
That's it.
properly trained.
Eastern 401 was a pivotal accident in aviation safety history, and we really didn't know this for about 10 or 15 years in terms of the true import of what it did to us, and focusing our attention on the fact that the way we handled things in the cockpit was not only not correct, but it was dangerous.
Investigators also make a disheartening find. When the nose gear indicator light assembly is examined, they discover that a light bulb inside is burnt out.
А, под этой. Это толпа.
Flight 401's landing gear was locked. The plane could.
Это толпа.
The only piece of the plane that failed was a $12 light bulb. The full legacy of Flight 401 will take years to unfold. It will ultimately alter how pilots are trained and how accidents are investigated. But first, the tale of Eastern Airlines Flight 401 will take a very disastrous twist. As far as the NTSB is concerned, the investigation of Eastern Airlines Flight 401 is over. Several recommendations were laid out to prevent similar accidents. Those include new regulations instructing air traffic controllers to warn pilots when they're getting too close to the ground. But 4 years
Sure.
later, it became clear there was a bigger lesson to be learned from Eastern Airlines Flight 401. In 1977, two
Deixa vinha. Deixa tão bala.
It was the deadliest plane crash of all
Tão
time.
bala. Malha boa. Tem uns tão bala.
The accident has caused
Yeah.
a string of miscommunications in the cockpit. Investigators established that 70% of crashes were due to pilot error.
Deixa tão bala.
Both of these accidents, Tenerife and 401. What you see is a crews dedicated to doing a good job, but not realizing that they're human, not realizing how many things can go wrong if you don't appreciate how human beings fail.
By the late 1970s, NASA began to explore a new behavioral science designed to reduce pilot error.
Pilots being able to look out for any different behavior.
It's called Crew Resource Management, or CRM.
Crew resource management simply means that we're not going to have one pilot leading and everybody else following. It means that the captain has to be a leader and listen to and interact with his subordinate crew members, and the subordinate crew members have to speak up.
Decades later, Flight 401 is taught in aviation courses around the world as a textbook.
The problem was
Yes, sir.
that we did not teach Bob Loft or Stockstill or any of these folks at the time that when something goes wrong, the commander's first responsibility is to maintain aircraft control, either do it himself or assign somebody.
2000.
Roman Tracker,
What frequency did he run us up at?
128.6. On Flight 401, Captain Loft did not clarify who should be doing what. Instead, all three crew members worked on the same problem.
What?
A buck? Just jiggle the buck? Gotta come out a little bit and then snap in.
With the co-pilot flying, the captain can have major problems. And guess what? Systemically, we have to thought what to do.
Today, CRM also trains flight crews not to be intimidated by one crew member's mood.
Is there a handkerchief or something so I can get a little better grip on this? Anything I can do?
Get down there and see if that damn
It
thing.
won't come out, Bob.
So if the leader is having a problem, in this case with a light bulb,
Okay. You got it sideways.
and he's really irritated at it, and the co-pilot has now made the problem worse. The co-pilot's not going to be happy with himself over that.
Well, what the hell's holding that damn thing in there?
Don Rico is not going to be happy that he got downstairs to try to solve the problem, and he couldn't see anything, and he's got to come up and report that.
I don't see it.
They're all tense.
John, I can't see it.
And when you get a crew like that tense, it's not trying to turn around to the captain and say you shouldn't have done that. But this is part of the evolution of what air safety has now learned and been able to teach so many other industries.
The enduring legacy of Flight 401 is the delegation of specific tasks in the cockpit. The result is fewer crashes. There was
Almost
also a
ставить.
result for this crash. For a while, it seemed that the crew of Flight 401 was haunting other Eastern Airlines flights. For some time after the crash, flight crews and passengers report seeing lifelike apparitions of Flight 401's crew. Many of the ghost sightings were on aircraft fitted with recovered parts from Flight 401. The ghost stories spread quickly. One book devoted entirely to those stories suggests that the ghosts were there to protect passengers and crew from further mishap.
The official reaction of Eastern Airlines to these ghost stories was one of absolute high-rolling denial in public and in private, a certain bit of panic.
There are so many ghost sightings that eventually Eastern Airlines removes Flight 401's cannibalized plane parts from all other aircraft. None of those who survived the crash will ever forget the horror they witnessed in the Everglades that night. And 35 years after their ordeal, many of them returned to that swamp to finally recognize the heroic efforts of Bob Marcus.
To say thank you.
Many of the incidents lived because Robert Marcus was there with his airboat. He saw them drowning and decided that the thing that he could do would be to save the ones he could save. Robert Marcus was the kind of person that opened arms ultimately would be if he were confronted with that sort of thing, but he drew on some special courage to do what he did. He was one of the true heroes of the crash.
A luxury jet on its maiden voyage is jolted in midair. Emergency. The plane has lost part of its wing.
It became clear that we were in very, very big trouble.
The crew struggles to land the badly damaged plane.
Really,
It's over when they hit the ground.
cinema.
The crew is detained and questioned by police. Somehow, this small plane has triggered the worst crisis in Brazilian aviation history.
Really?
September the 29th, 2006, in São José dos Campos, Brazil.
Cinema.
It's a big day at Embraer headquarters. The Brazilian aviation firm has just sold a brand new private jet to XLR, a US charter company. The price tag, $25 million.
It's a beautiful airplane, and it's a beautiful little ceremony
3D?
that every air had.
Окей. Ага. Кайл молодец, да? 3D классный, классно. Молодец, Кайл. Да-да-да. Мы 3D есть. Окей.
The cabin redesigned for comfort. It can seat up to 30
Okay.
people. And in its first 4 years of service, Embraer has delivered almost 100 of these sleek business jets. XLR will use the jet to fly customers around the world. But first, the company has to get the plane up to the United States. Joseph
Круто.
will be at the controls for the jet's maiden voyage. They've been down in Brazil for a couple of weeks.
Я вам напомню, что это 3D.
Joe
Не
Sharkey
забыть.
is a reporter for the New York Times. He's been offered a free ride.
Да.
We were delivering an airplane, basically, and my role was hitchhiker, and they kindly invited me along.
Это Даша.
The Legacy jet is heading to Manaus in northern Brazil, a stopover on its way to New York. Half an hour on
Почему я
the Legacy is flying
так
over the heart
раньше не готовила мышь? Восторге хочет еще. Да. Кто еще хочет?
window is spectacular.
А, яйца как готовят. Таша, я их умею готовить. Таша.
Just remember how pretty
Я знаю.
At 10 minutes to 4 in the afternoon,
Рецепт.
the Legacy jet makes contact with controllers
Ah,
at the Pacific Area Control Center, still nearly 100
Ай, Даша, я умею. Ой, я их умею готовить. Не проблема. О, Макс. О. Вечерю бокса с едой. Слушай. А, да. Это, Макс звонит во второй часть. Да. Мистер Бокс, это подписчика 2, вторая часть.
One of the many planes they'll be dealing with today is the Legacy jet.
Точно.
Every flight that's
Значит, говорит, как народ побольше лайков, выпустить серию.
moving in the direction of the plane. The computer also displays the plane's actual and planned altitudes.
November 670.
Я написал. Сендецкий.
Controllers use it to confirm that the data on their screen is coming from the plane they think
Ну, дети. Вы же еще с кинотеатра остались. Вот. Ты же самое.
An hour later, the flight has settled into a familiar routine.
Well, sort of settled down, everybody was
Yeah.
working, and it was just a very, very calm, peaceful time. I was writing notes from one of the interviews after a tour. Brazilian November 600.
But in the cockpit, Paladino is having trouble getting back in touch with air traffic controllers in Brazil.
Удобнее, чем тебе.
Brazilian November 600 X-ray.
He can't raise controllers on the frequency he
Они там,
uses.
значит, сердечку есть. Еще запасные.
Brazilian November 600. Brazilian November 600. X-ray.
After 12 attempts, Paladino finally gets in touch with Brazilian ACC, this time with a different controller who provides radio frequencies for future contact.
Contact what? SOP.
Sorry, I didn't go ahead.
Тукайл.
Frequency one more time for November 600 X-ray Lima.
The Legacy loses radio contact again.
Все, все.
Brazilian November
Я все сделал.
600
Он
X-ray
там поставил. И вон тут.
As the pilots try to restore
Всё,
communication
всё.
with Brasilia, the plane continues to
А, тут не вход, вход по с другой стороны.
It's just minutes before 5 o'clock.
Там две, там две. Нормально.
Suddenly there was the loudest bang I've ever heard in my life. The concussion itself seemed to affect every atom in my body.
Да это упал.
No one's sure what's happened to the jet. But when Joe Sharkey looks out of the window, he's stunned by what he sees.
О, вот
The
так.
end of the wing, well, it was serrated, chewed. It became clear that we were in very, very big trouble.
XLR Vice President Ralph McHaley rushes to the window for a look at the damage.
I said to Ralph, how bad is it? And he looked at me and he said, it's bad.
With more experience flying this type of plane, co-pilot Paladino takes over control of the limping jet.
Just let me fly the thing, alright? For the setting, I'll look it down. Okay, zero.
О, тут.
The crew still can't make contact with controllers.
Remember 600, X-ray Lima, declared emergency.
Я еще мешать не буду.
The entire tip of the Legacy's wing is breaking up. That affects airflow and is making the plane hard to control.
Yeah, good, okay?
As the plane begins to descend, passengers in the back are worried that the damaged wing is getting worse.
Our main concern was that wing that had taken such a hit that the structural integrity of the wing was obviously in question. The leading edge was separated.
With so much damage to the wing, the pilots can't turn sharply. Too much stress could rip the wing right off.
Или.
In a position where we realized we
No,
were going to die.
no.
I thought of my wife. I thought, well, okay, one thing I can do is I can write a note to my wife, which I think I've got my children's notebook, and I wrote, a short note saying that I loved her. Well, just saying, but
The Amazon is a bad place to have to land a plane. It's a dense jungle for as far as the eye can see.
there's nothing down the trees. And I thought, where am I going to put this airplane down?
Just hours into its maiden voyage, the badly damaged jet is going down. Paladino and the paused flying will soon be analysed and debated throughout Brazil. The verdict against them will be harsh.
Please answer November 600, X-ray Lima.
The crew of the Legacy jet searches desperately for a place to land their crippled plane. Captain Joseph Lepore finds a small military base on his chart.
November 600, X-ray Lima.
O, для цветов.
November 600, X-ray Lima. We need to land at Sierra Bravo Charlie Charlie.
Не сюда, да?
Do you know how long the runway is?
Сюда.
2600 meters.
Stand by. 600, right? Okay, we're coming in. We're in emergency. This is November 600, X-ray Lima.
The 2,600 meters is more than long enough to land a Legacy, but the crew doesn't know how the plane will respond when it touches down.
The canopy of green, there was a slash of ground about 2 miles away. I heard Joe say, "There's an airport."
Sierra Bravo, we see you. We're coming in.
Finding an airport was a stroke of luck, but the crew's troubles are far from over. Now they have to get the damaged jet safely on the ground. Palladino and Lepore can't configure their plane for a routine landing.
Hold it, pick up the flaps, top the flare. Right from Guinea 9, on the flare. 9.
Extending flaps increases the size of the wing. Since a bigger wing can generate more lift, pilots can slow down to land.
Yeah, okay.
With all the damage they've sustained, the crew doesn't want to put too much pressure on their wing. They won't be able to extend their flaps until the last moment. They'll have to land faster than usual.
Who wants to sit down back there?
When you land under this sort of circumstances,
Сделано.
and you get a real
Чего? Да.
just how fast an airplane is actually moving, because you're coming down gangbusters. I see.
А, ты по-другому.
Just sort of, it looked almost like a movie with one of those moving backgrounds. And I'm thinking, I hope this runway doesn't run out.
Yeah. Palladino hits the brakes hard.
Good. Good. You got it. Hold it.
Then finally the plane begins to slow.
Good job.
Oh,
Oh, man.
And then finally, we come to a halt. There's that beautiful silence that occurs when the engines are shut down. Everything is just quiet.
For more than 25 minutes, the business jet has flown with part of its wing torn off. There's also damage to the plane's tail. Somehow, high over the rainforest, something tore into the plane. The bizarre day takes another strange twist. Because they've landed at a military base, soldiers confiscate the passports of everyone on board.
And that's the point at which I realized that there were some customs. I don't think the
Солдаты.
others on the airplane had the immediate sense that this was a custodial situation.
Along with the two pilots, the jet's passengers are taken to the nearby airbase. The emergency on board the Legacy jet has thrown Brasilia ACC into turmoil. But it's not the only problem controllers there are facing.
Это на втором этаже.
Another plane they're expecting to see hasn't shown up. Gold Flight 1907 is
Уже?
on radar.
Уже?
The missing flight is a Boeing 737 with 154 people on board. It's been in the air for 2 hours and should be nearing Brasilia. But controllers there can't find any trace of that plane.
There isn't any gold. There isn't any gold in this here.
They check its status with controllers in labs who were last in contact with the plane.
Anxiety was high, and controllers were confused about what to say.
А,
They didn't
блин,
know.
окон нет.
Deep in the Amazon, those who were on the XLR jet are
Ну,
also
задолбал.
struggling to figure out what happened.
We had something. That's all I know.
Что-то мешает.
37,000 feet. Well, maybe it was a military jet. The plane wasn't exploded. The debris fell. Would have been more than
As they're trying to piece together the day's strange events, the group gets some shocking news. A gold flight has crashed. It's the plane that's been missing.
I just heard 737 got down in the Amazon River.
3 уже. Скоро финал.
It was like a thunderclap. The world changed. The Joe
Такая пол где-то около 6
I will
тысяч.
never see two more anguished men in my life.
The gold flight crashed right where the Legacy lost a piece of its wing. It can't be a coincidence.
С окнами не получится. Теперь я уже... Да, уже есть. Как нас внутри будут делать?
Approximately 100 kilometers from the military base, the wreckage of Gold Flight 1907 has been found.
Ну вот, мы уже. Или не еще.
When it hit the ground, the trees covered it up, making it hard to get
Да нет, это лучше.
The shattered remains of the plane litter the jungle floor. The news hits controllers in Brasilia extremely hard.
Вот это вот и все. Что за бред? Я с этим я быстро справлюсь. То есть у меня есть симметрис. Еще не травы.
Levamos ali pelo menos uma hora.
Все.
A makeshift
Easy.
helicopter landing pad is carved out of the jungle. It's becoming increasingly clear that no one has survived. 154 people are killed. At the time, it's the worst crash in the history of Brazilian aviation. What's happened in the skies above the Amazon? Investigators face
Ты понял для чего? Для огорода. Задолбай. Задолбай. Задолбай.
is in charge of the investigation into the gold crash.
An investigator
Задолбай.
You can't start with any preconceived idea. When we arrived at the location of the accident, the only thing we knew for sure was that we had found the plane that was missing.
The wreckage of the gold jet is spread over more than 2 kilometers. The widespread debris tells investigators that the plane ripped apart before crashing to the
Еще
ground.
вход сделать.
The aircraft disintegrated during the fall. It hit the ground in pieces. There was practically no damage caused by the impact with the ground.
Так?
The plane had already fallen apart.
Теперь, я не знаю, вот так с этой стороны сделать.
On October the 2nd, just 3 days after the crash, the plane's flight data recorder is found. Most of the cockpit voice recorder is also recovered, except for one critical part.
In this accident,
Вот так.
the impact was so strong that the module separated from the recorder.
Modern voice recorders don't use tape. Conversations are recorded digitally onto a memory module. But that part of the gold CBR has broken free. Without it, the rest of the cockpit voice recorder is useless. While the search for the module continues, Pereira looks at the information from the 737's flight data report. He learns that the plane was flying at 37,000 feet. It was on course and flying level at its assigned altitude. Then, without warning, the plane pitched over and plummeted toward the ground. Whatever happened, it was sudden and catastrophic. The data recorder tells Ferreira that the plane spun 11 times before it hit the ground.
What else? I can't see gold. There isn't any gold this here. So it's already ahead yet.
Police investigators want to know what air traffic controllers can tell them about Gold Flight 1907's final minutes.
There was no
Так, я
name.
скажу, да и все.
In fact, we never had contact with the gold jet.
Controllers say there was no warning that the jet was in trouble. It simply vanished. Colonel Ferreira studies air traffic control data from the day of the accident. There is no sign of the Gold Flight. But the readings from the smaller Legacy jet capture his attention. It seems to be flying erratically. Instead of keeping to a single altitude, the radar shows it flying up and down dangerously.
Арбуз. Сюда.
Perhaps the private jet pilots were testing out their new plane by climbing and descending quickly. They may have collided with the Gold jet as a result of their reckless flying. When that information leaks out to the country's newspapers, it makes front-page news.
The population thought it was unjust.
Вкус черники.
Was able to make an emergency landing, swap
Сюда.
larger aircraft with 154
Ежевика.
people, so the Amazon and everyone died.
Neither Lepore nor Palladino
Посмотри. О, малина, она мелкая. Предельно сюда. Так, даже где расти. Опять ежевика. Сюда. Малина опять. Две кустарища. Сюда. Все. И огород свой. Все. Огородил. С капустой. Ну, как получилось, так получилось. Ну, а как у меня распустили, я же не знаю. А я как бы мы даже не можем, а хозяева разберутся сами. И капуста, короче. Сидит, я же знаю. Правильно. Ой, ты задолбала. Задолбала. Там, зритель опять задолбал. Туда, сюда. Сейчас... Я не эксперт, победа.
Ferreira can see that both planes fly at the same altitude, 37,000 feet. He makes a horrifying discovery. For some reason, the two planes were on collision course. Air traffic is typically routed along specific essentially highways in the air. But planes traveling in opposite directions are supposed to be separated by at least 1,000 feet.
The airway system, for instance, between Brazil and Manaus is very safe. It makes airplanes fly northbound, maintaining even levels, and airplanes flying southbound, maintaining odd levels.
But science, the Legacy jet and the Gold 737 highway in opposite directions. In minutes, they were heading straight for each other. It seems more and more
Сколько мне не получится.
two planes collided.
Если там. Да я даже в доме еще не был.
At the crash site, workers find support for this incredible theory. The left wing of the Gold Flight is recovered. Investigators discover that about halfway along the wing, it's sliced clean through.
О, Вообще нифига, он еще пустой.
The precise nature of the cut tells Ferreira that this is not damage that was caused by impact with the ground.
Это долбало.
The damage on the left wing clearly shows that it was caused by a collision with another plane. The badly damaged wing would have sent the 737 into a spiral.
Whoa!
The pilots would have had no way of controlling it.
О,
The sudden spiral motion would have pulled the plane apart. It's the reason the wreckage is spread over such a wide area. Ferreira finds the most conclusive evidence of a collision on the Legacy's damaged wing.
On the Legacy, we found very small pieces of paint that came from the gold wing.
Together, the planes have a combined speed of 1,600 kilometers an hour. At that speed, the wingtip of the small jet easily sliced through the 737. Colonel Ferreira now understands what caused the gold jet to crash, but he doesn't
это
know why.
долбало.
How have
That's
the
a
two
dumb
jets
fuck.
ended up in the exact same airspace
That's a
without
dumb-
any contact?
Ой, блядь. Вот.
Investigators in
Bad.
Brazil realize that they are dealing with something very unusual.
A mid-air collision is a very rare event in aviation, and it should not have happened to very modern aircraft.
The situation becomes more complicated when investigators study a critical document, the Legacy's flight plan.
Flight plans are filed by using a standard form which is the same all over the world. The form will contain the flight number as well as requested flight level or altitude.
According to this document, when it collided with the gold jet, the executive jet wasn't
Это
expected to fly
долбало.
at
Это
37,000
долбало.
feet.
Это
The
долбало.
Legacy's flight plan called for the jet to fly at 37,000
That's
feet only until it reached Brasilia, then descend to 36,000. But the collision took place 850 kilometers northwest of Brasilia, well past the point where the Legacy was supposed to descend. So why hadn't the Legacy
Good
followed
idea.
its flight plan?
Flight calls for you to descend to 60 in Brazil.
Before we took off, we were cleared for 370 all the way to the house. That's what we did, sir. I don't know where you get the information. Yeah, we followed the rules.
Colonel Ferreira needs to check the story that the crew is telling. He wants to know exactly what they were told by controllers when they took off from San Jose dos Campos.
600 activate the emergency supervision force now. Wheels have 0.
Это долбало.
The Legacy's last instruction was to fly all the way to max at 37,000 feet. The pilots obeyed that instruction even though it differed from their flight plan.
Air traffic control
Удалить.
because they
Вообще
have best knowledge of the actual traffic situation.
не нужно удалить.
Leaving
That's
Manaus,
bad.
the Gold Jet was also cleared to fly at 37,000 feet.
Это bad.
Both planes were assigned the same altitude by controllers at opposite ends of the country.
Once we were certain that both planes were flying at the same altitude, we knew for sure there would be a lot to investigate on the side of air traffic control.
Turns his attention to conversations between controllers in Brasilia and the Legacy jet. The cockpit voice recorder from the Legacy gives investigators a remarkably detailed look into what happened on the private jet. The brand new Legacy jet has a state-of-the-art recorder that captures 2 hours of conversation.
The CVR was probably the most important component from the investigation.
At 10 minutes to 4, the crew is told to change radio frequencies and get in touch with the controller monitoring their flight.
Additional 1, sorry, 12505,
Это bad.
At this point, the legacy jet is approaching Brasilia, but the crew never receives any instructions regarding their altitude.
Brasilia, November 600 X-ray, Lima, 370.
November 600.
The legacy call to Brasilia, flight level 370. According to the flight line, it should have been descending to 360, but air traffic control forgot to give the order to the legacy to descend to 360.
Tylko twali.
They were meant to stay at 370.
Sydą pali, skrypki byli.
No airplane should ever change altitudes without receiving instructions from air traffic control.
Nie, nie, to. A.
To discover why controllers didn't give that crucial instruction, Colonel Pereira takes a closer look at the technology used to monitor traffic over Brazil.
О.
On the radar screen, we see the
Помню, перестроить надо.
Each flight has an individual code assigned to it that helps controllers track it. Separate numbers. On the left, the plane's actual altitude. On the right, the altitude the plane is supposed to be at according to its flight plan.
So here, the number changes to 360.
As the legacy jet passed over Brasilia, the number on the right changed. According to the flight plan, at this point, the plane was supposed to descend to 36,000 feet, 360.
The manual only Brazilian air traffic control system is using this kind of design. In other parts of the world, this update has to be done manually.
The computer changed a single number, which led to a critical error. Without much experience with the computerized system, the controller mistook the new planned altitude for the plane's actual altitude.
Só que o sistema mudou automaticamente.
The system changed it automatically from the authorized altitude to the planned altitude, which made the controller believe the legacy was flying at 360.
O outro controlador veio sobre o serviço e ele passou para ele um nível de
Brasil.
de voo 360.
Police investigators talked with the controller who was on duty when the number changed on the screen.
Понял, где? Вали.
He tells police about a critical mistake on his part.
You have 5 minutes left. The legacy is at 367.
Before leaving, he handed his flights off to another controller, telling him where he thought the legacy was flying.
I believe it was at 360. That's what I put.
When the new controller took over, the one being relieved gave him the legacy's altitude information according to the flight plan.
Oh.
But the jet was actually flying 1,000 feet higher, right in the path of the goal flight. Colonel Pereira studies transcripts of conversations on board the Legacy and finds the crew was having their own difficulties during the flight.
That's a good question.
The crew seems unfamiliar with some of the jet's advanced systems.
We're going to have to teach them how to work this flight management system. Where's the one that gives us trouble this time?
My impression is that the pilots were trying to learn their aircraft systems during the flight.
Investigators also uncover a breakdown in communications.
Virginia, November 600 X-ray.
After a brief conversation between the Legacy jet and Brasilia ACC, Colonel Pereira notices something extremely unusual. The Legacy pilots don't talk to anyone on the ground.
They stayed 57 minutes without attempting any contact with air traffic control, which seems like
Непонятно. Комната еще будет.
57 minutes. They tried to call 12 times without success.
Эй! Ира, подвисай.
Brazilian November 600.
Palladino did try to get hold of ground control, but he couldn't get through.
Спальня.
He then tried the backup frequencies listed on his navigation charts.
Brazilian November 600 X-ray Lima.
Попросите, блин.
His only contact, a single garbled message.
Both pilots and air traffic controllers should have been more concerned of maintaining two-way contact all the time. This is their duty.
Pilots and controllers spoken, they might have discovered that the Legacy was flying north in a corridor reserved for southbound traffic. As the public learns about the mistakes in the Air Traffic Control Center, there is growing pressure to make some changes.
We wanted to understand what had happened to these people inside the control room. Controllers should have been able to see on their radar screens that these two airplanes were flying in a collision course.
Brazilian air traffic control is one of the last in the world to be run largely by the country's military.
Since they're run by the military, they're run by Brazilian Air Force. We did not have complete access to information except for what was released.
As fingers are pointed at controllers, many of them come forward with stories of overwork or training.
They complained that they weren't well trained in English language, which is the international aviation language. Also, they had complaints about their equipment.
In fact, the controller who incorrectly reported the Legacy's altitude had been on the job for only a year. A valuable piece of the puzzle.
Я нужно иметь пойдет. Давно уже.
Investigators still don't know what happened during the final minutes of the Golden Hunt. Soldiers have been scouring the Amazon jungle with metal detectors looking for the plane's missing memory module.
Я на этом уже давно уже. Года 2 уже, наверное. Сколько?
Almost a month after the crash.
Я уже 3 играю, уже не помню.
Colonel Ferreira hopes to hear
Десятилетие, да?
why the Gold crew wasn't able to avoid colliding.
Уже 40-й. Ого. Это или 23, или 20.
Thanks very much, Brazilian 1.2. No, 197.
А это еще на квартире было.
No warning that they were flying straight for another gear.
Значит, в 22 году. 3 года уже. Кажется, я уже знаю, сколько я играю. 3 года уже. Ну, на геймпаде. Уже 3 год. Стало... Он уже начал все больше и больше играть. Да! Уже просто стал. Эй! Отлично, блин. Иди еще мусор. Только сказал, подвисает немного. Да. Это невозможно. Это капец, это же невозможно.
Both planes were equipped with a safety feature designed to prevent exactly this type of accident. Ferreira now needs to know why.
Где?
Earlier in the investigation, strange radar images suggested that the Legacy pilots were flying wildly over the
А где мусор? 5?
Now those suspicions have vanished, but Ferreira revisits the
Пакет с мусором.
to understand
Ладно.
why neither plane knew the other was coming.
Нету.
To try to understand this last piece of the puzzle, Colonel Ferreira returns to the
Там
radar
подвисает.
that air traffic control saw the day of the crash. Instead
А?
of displaying just
Там
the
пистолет задолбала.
the letter Z
is
Хватит, задолбалось это. Хоть виснуть, блин.
the set on the air traffic control screen indicates that the airplane is looking at has lost its transponder.
Задолбало.
Modern commercial aircraft are equipped with transponders. Like small radio stations, they broadcast information on the plane's altitude and flight number. This information is received by computers on the ground and instantly displayed on the screens of air traffic controllers. In Brasilia, if the transponder fails, so-called primary radar takes over automatically. Signals are sent out from the ground that hit the target and return. Those readings are wildly inaccurate.
Primary radar only is a passive indication of anything that is flying through the airspace. The difference of the actual altitude in the primary radar system might differ several thousand feet.
Теперь со мной лучше не связываться. После эксперта F1 и Хардаблин.
Investigators discovered that the transponder wasn't sending out signals for more than 50 minutes before the crash.
Теперь будет сложнее выиграть.
That may be because they didn't notice the subtle change.
The way in which the information is displayed to the controller is not visually alerting to the change. There are no flashing lights that would tell the controller that the plane has lost its transponder.
Chamasse realmente a atenção do controlador para que, naquele momento, aquela aeronave perdeu.
There's an even more critical role played by the transponder. It doesn't just beam information to controllers on the ground, but to other planes as well. All commercial aircraft are equipped with a warning system called TCAS, Traffic Collision Avoidance System.
TCAS gives the relative position of other airplanes within range of your own airplane.
TCAS picks up a signal from an oncoming plane's transponder and issues a warning if it's too close. If either plane's transponder is off, the system won't work.
Что ты мешаешь? Коробка, блин, задолбала, блин.
Ferreira discovers that the Legacy's transponder was working early in the flight and after the collision. But for more than 50 critical minutes, it was silent. Cal had a state-of-the-art jet just off the factory floor, developed problems with its transponder.
Parada de funcionamento, transmissão, transponder.
The failure of the transponder certainly contributed to this accident.
Para o acidente. E nós temos
And we had to find out what caused it to fail.
quem causou essa interrupção no funcionamento.
Investigators examined the Legacy jet's transponder unit. They discovered that the system which controlled it had a troubled history. It had been installed on a different plane, but removed because it wasn't working. It was repaired and then placed on the jet that was sold to XLR. Investigators had the system tested, but even with its suspicious past, after the crash they could find no obvious problems with the plane's transponder. Colonel Pereira does notice something potentially dangerous about the design of the Legacy cockpit. If a pilot uses the built-in footrest during flight, his toes can come in contact with the buttons on the transponder.
What it looks like in standby.
And when the transponder does go into standby, it would be difficult for a pilot to notice.
There's no alarm.
A small yellow warning light is the only indication that the
Тебе еще, блин,
transponder is
задолбали уже.
It was not easy for the pilots to detect that.
Задолбали.
Mixed up with the central warning alert system.
But the pilots of the Legacy jets do not remember using the plane's footrest.
I'm looking at the kinks and I work with flight management system.
Investigators suspect that one of the pilots may have turned the transponder off by mistake.
The most probable scenario is that by accident, one of the pilots temporarily turned off the equipment as he tried to familiarize himself with the technology on board.
However, the transponder went off. At a critical moment, the crew had no last-ditch safety system to warn them that they were flying right at a 737. Even though the TCAS system on the Gold plane was working, there was no signal from the approaching jet for it to receive. Closing in on each other at 1,600 kilometers an hour, the pilots never saw each other coming. Brazil's air traffic control system would undergo some radical changes as a result of the collision. But those changes would not come without a fight. The investigation into the crash of Gold Flight 1907 has uncovered dangerous problems with Brazil's air traffic control system. Two planes were assigned to fly at the same altitude in the same airspace. Overworked and inexperienced controllers in Brasilia neglected to instruct the legacy jet to descend to 36,000 feet.
You have 5 aircraft. The legacy is at 3C7.
Then they mistook the
Все, ну, бро,
To make matters worse, the legacy pilots, unfamiliar with Brazilian airspace, were unable to make contact with controllers on the ground. And somehow the transponder, which broadcasts their location in the sky, went silent, which controllers in Brasilia failed to notice. A multi-billion-dollar ATC system designed to keep planes apart had failed to detect two planes on a collision course.
One by one, a series of human errors occurred, and all of the defense systems that exist to avoid these errors were defeated. A month after the crash of the Gold passenger plane, controllers begin a work to rule campaign. They want to draw attention to problems with the system.
Once they did start working to the rules and not stretching them anymore, this triggered what we call the aviation crisis in Brazil. At a certain point, maybe 40% of flights in all of Brazil had over an hour delay.
Following the crash and the work slowdown, changes start being made.
There have been a lot of changes in Brazilian aviation after the accident, specifically with regards to air traffic control. The Air Force had to admit that they had a shortage of controllers, and also there's a higher degree of accountability.
In the United States, the Federal Aviation Administration issues two recommendations as a result of the tragedy. Pilots could accidentally turn off the transponder. And manufacturers are told that an alarm should sound if the TCAS system shuts off. The controllers who were involved in the crash are charged with varying degrees of manslaughter. But those criminal charges worry people who are personally involved in the disaster.
Uma investigação com fins de prevenção. Quando existe
An investigation like ours, which focuses on prevention, suffers huge setbacks, and there is pressure to lay charges.
By blaming people, we might be creating a picture where people will not report and be honest about failures and mistakes. And when we try to hide that, things get swept under the carpet, and soon enough they'll come out again.
Nenhum controlador sai de casa.
No controller leaves his home in the morning thinking he's going to crash a plane. And so the criminalization only interferes with investigations that can prevent further accidents.
More than 2 months after the crash, the crew of the Legacy jet is finally allowed to return to the United States.
Joe and Jan barely got out of the country. There was an attempt to hold them under, I thought it was a cobbled together initial criminal charge of quote, failing to ensure the safety of Brazilian sky.
Fighting people.
Safe return of John King, everyone aboard the Legacy. We all saddened by this tragedy which took many innocent lives.
More than a year after the accident, the Legacy jet that survived the mid-air collision was still at the airfield in the Amazon. Its maiden voyage cut short by a tragic series of technological and human errors.
Частный не документал. Честно. Ой. Oops.
Every passenger jet is a traveling life support system, carrying inside it the highly pressurized oxygen that keeps us alive. If it ever escapes, a simple flight becomes a living nightmare. United 811.
There was nothing in front of us or to the side of us. The whole side of the plane was gone.
Aloha 243.
Everything was being sucked out of the plane.
British Airways 5319.
I'll never forget, his face was hitting the side script, but he didn't blink.
Sometimes it takes a terrible accident to expose hidden dangers and change the way airplanes are built.
Unfortunately, we wait until we have enough bodies.
I believe that.
Many of the changes have been in fact written in blood.
Ja. Det är topp.
This is the assembly plant for the Airbus A320. After the Boeing 737, it's the most popular jet plane ever built. Almost the airline equivalent of a minivan. The aluminium skin on the top of an A320 is less than 2 millimeters thick, about as thick as a coin. But this slender piece of metal helps keep passengers alive. Because the skies aren't nearly as friendly as they seem.
Most people take aviation absolutely for granted. The difference between being on a commercial airliner at 35,000 feet and being in a space capsule in orbit is really not all that different. They're both life support systems. The reality is it's a hostile environment. The reality is it's 50 degrees below zero outside. The reality is that jet stream or that air stream out there will kill you almost immediately.
It's not natural for people to travel through this killer atmosphere. But every day, millions of us fly easily some 3,000 meters higher than the top of Mount Everest.
All our life support that's natural for us is down here at the bottom of this sea of air. And if we swim up too high, however we get there, if we're not protected, we can't live.
But taking oxygen with us up to 11,000 meters is potentially dangerous. The air inside an airplane is pressurized, so passengers can breathe easily. As planes climb, the pressure outside decreases. The tightly packed air in the cabin begins exerting tremendous pressure on the fuselage.
On an average jetliner, it means that every square meter of the fuselage must support more than 5,000 kilograms of force. And on almost every flight, the fuselage wins the battle. But only because airplane designers have learned tragic lessons.
We have concentrated in the past on changing things, but unfortunately we wait until we have enough bodies.
In the 1950s, a series of shocking accidents triggered changes that are still seen today.
The Comet has raised new triangles, achieving new speeds, setting a new standard.
The passenger jet era began in the 1950s with the introduction of the de Havilland Comet. For the first time, jet engines were being used to push commercial planes higher than ever before.
What Great Britain had at stake with the Comet was enormous. They wanted to really declare their place in civil aviation by having the first successful jet transport aircraft.
But less than 2 years after its maiden flight, the glittering jewel of British aviation disintegrated in mid-air.
It would have been horrible. It would have been a horrible situation, but mercifully it would have been quick. But they had found that the bodies that they had recovered, massive decompression, of course, caused the air inside your lungs to burst your lungs. At the same time, the outrush of air would tear you from your seat, and many of these people actually smashed their heads against the structure.
3 months later, another comet ripped apart in flight. Officials feared that every single comet could be a flying time bomb. The entire fleet is grounded.
The design of the Comet was actually a very sound design. There was only one thing that they didn't do, and it's because nobody knew.
Unknown to engineers, there was a deadly flaw in the comet's basic design. To find the jet's fatal weakness, investigators built a massive water tank. They immersed a stripped-down comet. The pressure in the tank was increased and decreased, simulating the strains of flight. The experiment ran 24 hours a day, 7 days a week.
Блин, я сегодня уже тут, я знаю, что я недельный
After
это
the
не
equivalent of
знаю.
some
Я задолбала.
3,000 flights, the comet's
3 года уже.
revealed itself. Its square windows.
You have a rapid change of direction in the shape, essentially a corner. You have a high stress concentration. It gave rise to a fatigue crack, which then traveled rapidly through the rest of the structure, causing a massive decompression.
The most advanced passenger jet in the world had succumbed to metal fatigue. The fuselage simply could not handle the force of the air inside, pressing out.
The airplane, with all that force behind it, suddenly unzipped itself.
Every plane that's built today is safer because of the disaster that struck the comet. Like other passenger planes, the windows on the A320 are rounded, so that pressure doesn't build up around the corners. Perhaps even more importantly, extra rivets reinforce the skin of today's planes to contain cracks that might start anywhere on the fuselage.
It's designed to go to that first row of rivets and absolutely be stopped. It's a healthy structure. It can never unzip itself.
But 34 years after the comet crash, aircraft manufacturers were faced with another tragic disaster. The extra rivets that were supposed to save lives failed to withstand the relentless power of air pressure on metal.
One of the
Ну,
fellows
кому-то готово.
said, you know, the day after this accident, I had to throw away most of what I knew about metallurgy and start over.
Тут уже готово. Спальня готова.
At this Airbus factory in Toulouse, France, A320s roll out at about the rate of one every working day. Titanium rivets, lightweight and extremely tough, hold the fuselage together. 3,000 are used to join the separate sections. Another 3,000 can be found on each wing. Without them, the fuselage couldn't contain the pressurized air that's forced inside during flight. But even these rivets aren't foolproof. April the 28th, 1988. Aloha Airlines Flight 243 is traveling from Hilo Airport on the Big Island to Honolulu. With this island hop, Aloha 243 is making its 9th flight of the day, a normal schedule for the planes of Aloha. Protected within the jet, passengers give little thought to the fact that the cabin is filled with pressurized oxygen. It's constantly pushing against the fuselage, trying to escape into the surrounding atmosphere. In the cabin, the pressure is kept at a constant level, so passengers feel like they've never left the ground. But as a plane rises to its cruising altitude, the air pressure outside the cabin is dangerously low.
Well, what we do is extract air from the engines and use that to pressurize the airplane. And what we can do then is control the pressure inside by a series of valves.
The air moving through the cabin creates constant pressure on the jet's fuselage, keeping it inflated like a balloon. Every modern jet is built to withstand this pressure.
There's an internal structure to a modern all-metal airplane. The skin without the structure would collapse easily. It would buckle easily. It would be sort of like a paper bag without any structure inside to hold it.
If you remove the skin of a passenger jet, you'll find hoop-shaped bulkheads and formers supporting the width of the aircraft. Stringers run the length of the plane. They all help support the fuselage. And the cabin needs all the help it can get, because as the plane gains altitude, that pressurized oxygen inside the plane is pushing against every square centimeter. On this day in April 1988, passengers are about to learn what happens when that air slowly escapes.
I saw a brilliant flash of light and boom.
Everything was being sucked out of the plane.
Aloha Airlines 243 has just suffered what experts call an explosive decompression. The air inside the plane that makes jet flight possible escapes in a sudden horrifying moment. 35 square meters of the fuselage are gone.
Just imagine the scene up there. The top of the airplane blowing. You now have 300 mile an hour wind blowing.
This is bad. That's bad.
Those people left for Hawaii in the springtime, not minus 50 degrees temperature. Any period of time is 24,000 feet. And those people will die.
Captain Bob Schornsteimer begins an emergency descent, dropping 20 meters a second. The stress on the damaged craft threatens to tear it apart.
Woman that was sitting next to me, her husband,
This
he
is
was on the other
bad.
side, the next row up. She was next to me, and they were reaching their hands out. They were trying to touch fingers to say goodbye.
Against incredible odds, the flight crew land their bruised and battered airplane. Even with this explosive decompression, there's only one death on Aloha Flight 243. A flight attendant who was pulled out of the plane. Jim Wildey investigates the crash for the National Transportation Safety Board. In his laboratory, Wildey makes a disturbing discovery. Running through some of the pieces of the plane's fuselage, he finds a series of hairline cracks. They're right beside the holes created by rivets and barely visible to the naked eye. But they're classic signs of metal fatigue.
Metal fatigue is something that sounds exotic, but it really is easy to understand. Any piece of metal has a certain breaking point. All of us have tried to open a tin can and not quite gotten the opener all the way around. We work it back and forth until that last portion breaks. You just demonstrated metal fatigue.
A plane isn't a rock-solid tube. To maintain the pressure passengers need to enjoy a flight, it's designed to be much more flexible.
The fuselage of the airplane is actually breathing. It expands and contracts depending on altitude. When it's on the ground, it's in a contracted status. When it's at altitude, 24,000 feet, the fuselage expands.
You can stand at the back of a 250-foot long jetliner and just sight along that fuselage, you'd see it begin to puff up a little bit.
And as a plane lands, the pressure differential between the inside and the outside of the plane disappears. The fuselage returns to normal.
So the airplane is constantly cycling. That's pressurization. That will weaken the structure over a long period of time.
Records show that the Aloha jet was 19 years old. 737s are designed for a 20-year service life and a recommended 75,000 flights. But as investigators take a closer look, they discover that the Aloha jet had logged an astonishing 89,000 separate flights. The short hops between the Hawaiian Islands meant that the planes in the Aloha fleet went through more pressurization cycles than any other aircraft.
You saw something as you got on this airplane. What did you see?
Investigator Jim Wildey gets a lead when he interviews one of the Aloha passengers. She says she saw a small crack in the fuselage just to the right of the door.
The witness saw cracking in this area, and we found fatigue cracking back in here. So this is the line where the fatigue cracking joined up. One piece came down this way and folded off. The other piece went across the top and came off to the right side.
But something doesn't make sense. The Aloha jet lost 35 square meters of its fuselage. In the years after the Comet disaster, Boeing and other companies have designed a safety feature that should have kept any tearing to an absolute minimum. Inside the fuselage of every 737, Boeing have installed a series of tear straps. If any kind of tear develops in the fuselage, it should only run as far as the next tear strap, never more than 13 centimeters away, before shooting off at a 90-degree angle. This would have prevented the sort of catastrophic disintegration that ripped apart the Comet.
The purpose of the tear strip is to confine any kind of rip or tear in the fuselage skin to a 10-inch square, basically. The 10-inch square allows a controlled decompression and confine any structural damage to a very small airplane.
But for Aloha 243, the tear straps did not contain the rupture caused by the metal fatigue. The NTSB believes there were so many cracks in the fuselage that they eventually joined together, tearing an enormous hole in the plane. But jets aren't held together by rivets alone. The Comet disaster had also highlighted the need to reinforce the fuselage. The skin of an airplane is built from separate panels which overlap. These panels are bonded together by a powerful adhesive known as epoxy. As the epoxy hardens, the panels are locked together by rivets. And during his investigation on the Aloha fuselage, Jim Wildey finds discoloration inside some of the overlapping joints.
You can see now where the dark material is the epoxy that was used to bond the two layers overlapping together. The white material you see here is corrosion damage of the aluminum fuselage.
The Hawaiian climate is great for tourists, but it's tough on airplanes. The ocean air is humid and heavy with salt. It can corrode even industrial epoxy. Investigators learned that Boeing, the company that built Aloha 243, had issued numerous written warnings about the epoxy. If it isn't applied at the right temperature, if the panels have moisture or dirt on them, the bonding can fail. Boeing recommended regular detailed inspections, but workers at Aloha didn't report any problems with the epoxy. They either never saw the compromised epoxy, or if they did, it wasn't repaired.
The stress that's trying to pull one skin away from the other skin piece, the stresses would go through the bonding and not through the rivets. Of course, as this thing becomes disbonded, now the rivets themselves are loaded, and especially this top row of rivets And this is the railroad, we think, that had the fatigue cracking unit.
These cracks go unrepaired, and now you have an airplane that is a ticking time bomb.
The fuselage on Aloha 243 was seriously compromised by several factors: poor maintenance, the age of the aircraft, and by the heavy tours of duty.
Since 1988, we have come light years in understanding this, and we no longer leave ourselves the tolerance that used to be left to airlines to just go out and take a look at the airplane and sign it off.
The Aloha accident was another step towards making passenger jets safer.
It's important to always learn from your mistakes. It's important to learn lessons from them. And that has been the case with aeronautical engineering.
The Aloha story was a brutal lesson in the dangers of metal fatigue. But it wasn't the last example of the power of cabin pressure.
Hey.
2 years later, the industry would get another terrifying reminder.
Ladies and gentlemen, this is your captain speaking.
My name is Tim Lancaster. Welcome aboard this British Airways
Flight to Malaga.
June the 10th, 1990. British Airways Flight 5390 is leaving Birmingham, England for Spain. 87 people are on board.
80 knots.
Two minutes into the climb, the flight crew switch on the autopilot. Captain Tim Lancaster takes off his shoulder straps.
To the flight deck to ask Tim and Alistair what they would like to drink.
You gentlemen like a tea?
Please, the usual.
Minutes later, at 5,200 meters, the plane is very close to its assigned altitude. And then, like a cork out of a champagne bottle, the windshield bursts from its frame. Captain Tim Lancaster is sucked out of his seat and is pinned to the fuselage by blistering winds roaring close to 550 kilometers an hour. The temperature is minus 17 degrees centigrade and there's very little oxygen. Co-pilot Alistair Atchison is alone at the controls. Ordinarily, cockpit windows cannot budge from their frames. The force of the air as the plane soars through the sky pushes the windshield onto the plane. But on Flight 5390, something has gone terribly wrong. Flight attendant Nigel Ogden rushes in to help.
And I looked at the flight deck door was resting on the controls.
Я знаю.
Window. I could grip him before he went out completely.
Other flight attendants do what they can. Co-pilot Alistair Atchison reduces speed and descends quickly. But as he slows the plane down, the drop in wind pressure lets the captain slide around on the side of the plane.
All I remember is Tim's arms flailing out. His arms seemed about 6 foot long. And I'll never forget that. His eyes were wide open. I mean, his face was hitting the side of the side screen. But he didn't blink. And I thought to myself, and I said to John, I said, I think he's dead. I think he's dead.
Just 35 minutes after taking off, Atchison gets his jet safely back on the ground. But the most unbelievable chapter of this entire story is the fact that Captain Tim Lancaster survives his incredible ordeal.
But I remember watching the windscreen move away from the aircraft, and then it had gone like a bullet, it disappeared into the distance. I was very conscious of going upwards, and well, the whole thing became completely surreal. And I was aware of being outside of the airplane, I can remember seeing the tail of the aircraft, I remember the engines going round, and on that I don't remember much more.
Tim Lancaster was pinned to the outside of the plane for over 20 minutes. His injuries were surprisingly minor. Bone fractures in his right arm and wrist, frostbite and shock. Within 5 months, Tim Lancaster was flying again. In the immediate aftermath, investigators have very little to go on.
Windscreen was missing, there was some amount of blood around, there was some minor breaks on the fuselage, as you'd expect, the windows gone off, and really that was about it. But a lot of people...
Minor cooking issue.
The maintenance log is recovered from the plane. Stuart Cullen learns the windscreen had been replaced just hours before takeoff.
Everything okay? Fine. She's just come out of maintenance, by the look at it.
Spalnia? To?
Change the windscreen.
I wanted to find out exactly what had happened to the aircraft before it took off.
Early in the investigation, the missing windscreen is found. It contains a curious piece of evidence.
There were something like 30 bolts found with it, most of which were one size short in diameter, one size too small in diameter.
On many planes, windscreens are fitted from inside the cockpit. Internal cabin pressure pushes against them, keeping them in place. But on the BAC 111, the windscreen is bolted from the outside. The pressurized oxygen inside the jet pushes out against the windscreen. The bolts must resist this pressure.
There are enough of them there that they simply can't pull out of the structure. But of course, if you then violate the very premise of that by putting the wrong bolts on, all bets are off. You're now a test pilot.
During his interview with the ground engineer who repaired the plane, Cullen gets a major break.
One thing that came out was that he said, oh, the old bolts went into a waste bin in the hangar where he did the job, and they may still be there. So we rushed across to the waste bin and found something like 80 discarded bolts.
The old bolts are the proper size. Why were smaller bolts used to replace them?
And these are the ones you checked against the new ones. That's right.
From the house, there's some really excellent evidence. Gold as far as I was concerned.
Instead of using the old bolts to put the new window on, the ground engineer decided to replace them. He did not check the parts catalogue to verify which bolts he needed for the job. The bolts he chose seemed the same, but in fact were just over 0.5 millimeter smaller. They were too thin to do the job. Early in the morning, working against the side of a hangar, the engineer couldn't tell the difference. Hours later, the window gave way. Faced with a challenge they weren't trained for, the crew still managed to pull their plane back from the brink. But the massive pressure inside an airplane doesn't need bad maintenance to rip a jet apart. That pressure can also find a tiny flaw somewhere in the design and cause a nightmare in the sky. The Airbus A320, one of the most popular passenger jets in the sky. Every day around the world, thousands of passengers board this plane. When they do, they walk through what would seem to be an obvious weak spot in the fuselage, the door. Any hole in the fuselage is a potential danger. So engineers designed passenger doors that can't be opened in flight.
It is virtually impossible. I don't use that word very easily, but it is impossible for a passenger to open a plug-type door in flight.
Passenger doors are plug-type doors. They're built to be slightly larger than their frames. When a plane takes off and pressurizes, The atmosphere inside the aircraft seals the door shut.
It probably has 10,000 or more pounds of pressure holding it firmly in place in that door frame, and you have to pull it out of that door frame to get it open.
But not all doors on an airplane are built the same. Even designs that seem flawless on paper can rip apart in the real world. February the 24th, 1989, Honolulu Airport. United Airlines 811 is bound for Auckland, New Zealand. Expected flying time, 9.5 hours. There are 355 people on board, plus a full load of cargo. The doors close on time, and the plane leaves the gates just after 1:30 in the morning.
That'll make it handle 33.
Okay. We did notice that there were thunderstorms 100 miles south, right on course, which was rather unusual for that time of night. So I left the seatbelt sign on.
Captain Cronin's decision to keep that sign on will save lives. As the 747 climbs past 7,000 meters, passengers sitting just above and behind the cargo door begin to hear a strange noise.
Kind of a grinding noise. I heard it like a thud.
The hell? In the next nanosecond, it was pure, unadulterated pandemonium.
The next thing I knew, I found myself on the stairwell, hanging on to the rungs, and I immediately knew it was an explosive decompression.
Everything on the airplane that wasn't fastened down, tied down, or secured became very the noise was incredible.
The 747's cargo door had torn off, ripping away a section of the fuselage. The pressurized oxygen in the cabin shot out with explosive force.
And if I looked up, that was the first time I saw this tremendous hole on the side of the aircraft that was devoid, and seats were missing, and I immediately knew that we had lost passengers.
Everything in front of us was gone. Where we were sitting, we were about 6 inches from the hole. So there was nothing
сделано.
to the side of us. The whole side of the plane was gone. That's what we were dangling on the hole. And I first thought we weren't going to make it. I just didn't think there was any hope.
The situation is desperate. But by
Там крыкнулись, и тут задолбало, блин, отвали! Отвали! Ну, жду входа, нафига так делать, блин? Быть какой-то, блин.
After the door
Там я
came
уже сделал.
eventually a row of rivets held, keeping the plane from pulling itself apart. But the gaping hole is putting massive stress on the aircraft. The flight crew needs to descend as fast as possible.
Left, right, valve, on, start to open the fuel. Amped up.
Struggling to fly their badly damaged jet, the crew turn back to Honolulu Airport.
Четыре уже. Стоп, вперед.
And all of a sudden, we were slowing down. And I said, oh my God, we've landed. We're on the ground.
4, 5.
Probably the best
2
landing
часа.
I've ever made.
Это...
When we finally stopped on the runway, we deployed all 10 chutes and provided telemetry
раньше.
all the passengers.
Thanks to the experienced flight crew, United Airlines 811 landed with everyone on board alive. But 9 passengers were missing, sucked out of the plane when the fuselage tore open, taking with it 5 rows of seats. One of those passengers was a New Zealander on his way home, Lee Campbell.
We got a phone call from Chicago, and they just said that they regret to inform us that our son was missing, presumed dead.
In the wake of their son's tragic death, Kevin and Susan Campbell embark on an international mission to discover exactly why the door had come off the plane.
Lee countersides the matter. You've got to find out why he done it, and you've just got to make sure that it never happens again.
2 months after the accident, the National Transportation Safety Board holds preliminary hearings. During a break, the Campbells take matters into their own hands. They remove several boxes full of files.
So we quickly realised we'd got a really good set of papers, a lot of things that hadn't been released to the public. We were able to really start our investigation of murders at that stage.
The unpublished documents reveal a disturbing catalogue of problems with the 747's forward cargo door, going right back to its original design. Passenger doors are plug doors, but most cargo doors on jets open outward. This increases the space for luggage and other cargo. As the plane gains altitude, the pressure inside the jet presses outward against the door. To prevent the door from opening, Boeing had installed what it believed was a foolproof locking system.
What they do is they build in multiple redundancies to make sure the door is properly latched and does not open. And you build it in to a point that it's extremely impossible.
The Campbell research uncovers 2 major flaws with the 747 cargo doors. The first involved the locking system. To lock the cargo doors, electric motors turn C-shaped latches around pins in the doorframe. A handle then moves arms or locking sectors over the top of the C-latches to prevent them from reopening. But on Flight 811, the supposedly foolproof system had failed. Kevin Campbell built a model of the 747 cargo door latch. It showed the first deadly flaw in the locking system. Aluminium locking sectors could not hold the C-latch in place if the latches started to open on their own.
With the aluminium locking sectors, if the C-locks tried to backwind, open electrically, it would just push the locking sector out of the way. It simply wasn't up to the job that it was designed for.
But what would cause the C-lock to back wide? The Campbells didn't have the answer, but they knew they were onto something. During their research, they learned that 2 years before Flight 811, a Pan Am 747 out of Heathrow had pressurization problems as it climbed to cruising altitude. The pilot was forced to turn back.
When I got back to Heathrow, the bottom, and all of the locks were open. When I got to the maintenance base, they found that all of the locking sectors were either bent or broken.
The passengers on this flight were lucky. They had survived the faulty locking system. But why had the C-latches turned and bent the locking sectors? As the Campbells continue to search, a Pan Am report surfaces that lays out a critical issue with the cargo door's electrical system. When the cargo door's outer handle is placed in the closed position, a master lock switch should disconnect the power supply. This would stop the C-latches from turning. But something was wrong with the switch.
There was power to the door locks with the outer handle closed, and the lock started to move, and it started to force the locking sectors out of the way.
The faulty power switch and weak locking sectors were no match for the pressurized oxygen inside the plane. After years of being pushed by the Campbells, the NTSB produces a report that agrees.
There was an inadvertent failure of either the switch or the wiring that caused an uncommanded opening of the door.
It's nice that other people know that you're right and have been all along. The support that they've given me was vindicated.
I would have looked at myself if we'd done our investigation. So it's just something we both felt we needed to do. We didn't even discuss it. We just knew that's what.
This is a job.
After United Flight 811, the locking system on the Boeing 747 cargo doors was changed. Inspections were increased. Another potential cause of explosive decompression had been found and eliminated.
That is an amazing accolade to what we've learned, not just Boeing, but what we've learned about maintenance, about structures, maintaining them, and inspecting them.
Since the first jet engines pushed planes higher in the sky, the aviation industry has struggled to harness and contain the deadly power of pressurized oxygen. They know all too well that a single flaw can lead to a terrifying decompression. But more than 15 years after United 811, another deadly lesson is learned. It's August the 14th, 2005. For almost an hour, Helios Flight 522 has been circling the skies over Athens. Its flight crew has stopped communicating with air traffic control. Fearing a terrorist attack, the Greek Air Force scrambles 2 fighter jets to circle the mystery aircraft.
One of them was actually in a shooting position behind the 777. The other one was nearby the cockpit and he was trying to communicate visually with the person in the cockpit.
The fighter pilots can't see any damage to the jet. No holes in the fuselage.
There is no structural failure. There is no fire. There is no problem, obvious problem, from the external view with the plane.
Someone in the cockpit waves at the fighter pilot, but all too soon the jet loses altitude and falls towards the ground. All 121 people on board are killed. It's the worst air crash in the history of Greece. Within minutes, investigators are on the scene.
So we climbed over the hill, and there we were, facing this situation, which was beyond any description. I saw a great area in front of me, which was burning. It was burning, people spread, pieces of the airplane.
The autopsies add more mystery to the case. Everyone on board the Helios flight was alive after the moment of the crash.
He appeared they did not die from inhaling a toxic substance in the airplane, from an explosion. These people died on impact.
But if the passengers were alive until impact, why didn't the fighter pilot see more activity on the plane? Akribos Tsolakis is the lead investigator. He begins to dig through maintenance records. He learns that on the day of the crash, the rear door had been inspected for leaks. Before it took off on its last flight, the Helios jet arrived in Cyprus with a problem. During the trip, the cabin crew had heard loud banging and saw lights on a rear service door. To make sure there's nothing wrong with the seal on the door, the engineer runs a pressurization test. He's looking for a leak.
To explain again how you tested the pressure. I went into the cockpit and turned the pressurization switch to manual. Switching digital pressure control unit from auto to manual.
The jet's engines are turned off, so the engineer uses the plane's auxiliary power unit to force air into the cabin.
Just like looking for a leak in a tire. In this case, what you're having to do is pressurize the aircraft, use a barometer essentially to monitor the pressure inside, and look for leaks that way.
A normally well-maintained jet liner of any age is simply not going to be completely airtight. You're going to have leaks. As a matter of fact, as pilots, we know that certain airplanes are going to leak more than
the pressurization test. The ground engineer reports that the jet is in good working order. But the digital pressure control is left in the manual position.
They were supposed to return the selector to the auto position.
If the flight crew fails to see that the switches are manual, their plane won't properly pressurize. The oxygen available inside the plane will be just as thin as the outside atmosphere. The passengers will be directly exposed to a deadly environment in which they cannot survive. August the 14th, 2005. The worst airline disaster in Greek history has stunned the nation. Investigators are sifting through the gruesome wreckage. A few minutes after 9 in the morning, Helios Flight 522 left from Cyprus bound for Athens. The crew has no idea that hours before takeoff during a maintenance test, a flight engineer has left a pressurization switch set to manual. Both the captain and co-pilot miss the fact that the plane is not set to pressurize automatically. As Helios 522 climbs, an alarm blares in the cockpit.
What is it? Is that a big warning?
It's a non-pressurization warning, but it sounds identical to another alarm. The pilots confuse the two. It's a critical mistake.
The alarm sounded as that alarm was misinterpreted. Most of flight crews, they would never face an alarm with non-pressurization in all their flight careers because it's a rare event.
А, так, потому так.
Flight 522, what can I do for you?
Так, потому так вот.
As the pilots troubleshoot with ground engineers, life-sustaining oxygen is slowly seeping out of the plane. Eventually, oxygen masks drop in the cabin. They do not fall in the cockpit.
The reason that we don't have automatically deploying oxygen masks in a cockpit, there's simply too much up there. If you had things popping out, they're going to hit switches that they shouldn't hit.
The crew don't realize
Oh,
the
fuck.
pressurization problem. Eventually, both the captain and the co-pilot collapse unconscious. The oxygen is too thin to breathe.
We're the ones that should be trained consistently to understand that ears popping, anything that indicates pressurization, you don't even talk to each other before you grab that mask and put it on.
The passengers are unaware that the plane is now flying itself. In emergency situations, chemical generators above the seats pump out oxygen. But there's a catch. These generators only produce enough oxygen for about 12 minutes.
Well, the problem with the passenger masks is, for one thing, they're not designed to keep you oxygenated at a high altitude. What they're designed to do is give you enough oxygen so that you can survive until the pilots get the airplane down to a low altitude.
But with both pilots already unconscious, the Helios jet did not descend so passengers could breathe without assistance. Instead, the plane flew on autopilot to Athens. When the oxygen supply stopped, the passengers passed out. By the time the Greek Air Force intercepted the Helios jet, only one person was still moving. Likely surviving with bottled oxygen, flight attendant Andreas Prodromou was still conscious when the fighters approached. He made it to the cockpit, but he couldn't save the plane. Eventually, when its fuel ran out, Helios 522 crashed. Investigators eventually find the panel with the pressurization switch.
Are you sure this is the way it was found? It hasn't been moved around.
All 121 people on the Helios flight died because their plane didn't carry enough life-sustaining oxygen as it climbed into the sky. It's been more than 50 years since the beginning of the passenger jet era. 50 years in which the industry has learned, sometimes painfully, how to safely fly more than 10 kilometers in the sky.
When you look back at all the other accidents over the last 20 years, in most cases, we were pushing the frontier of knowledge.
Unfortunately, when you're pushing the envelope, you're pushing the boundaries of design, you're going to encounter problems that you hadn't anticipated.
In search of the safest plane imaginable, the history of aviation traces a flight path from tragic accidents to technological breakthroughs. Many of these accidents display the incredible power of explosive decompression. The Airbus A320 and every other passenger plane built today is infinitely safer than the first jets that flew in the 1950s. They have to remain safe and get even safer because we rely so heavily on this incredible mode of transportation that takes us somewhere we were never meant to be. In the ocean near Los Angeles, on a lonely mountain in Japan, off the east coast of Canada, a plane crash can reduce an enormous jet plane to mangled pieces. The cause is buried somewhere in the wreckage.
In the business, we refer to often finding the golden nugget.
A model jet plane is made up of hundreds of thousands of parts. A failure in any one of them can lead to disaster.
A missing screw can jeopardize the safety of flight.
Constant checks keep planes flying and passengers safe. A single oversight can end in tragedy.
Something exploded.
A hot summer night in Phoenix, Arizona. It's 11 o'clock, but the maintenance workers at Southwest Airlines are just getting started. Tonight they're going to open up a state-of-the-art Boeing 737-700. Almost 40 inspectors and mechanics are going to spend the night making sure the plane is fit to fly.
Without proper maintenance, airplanes don't fly. Pilots are usually the focus for the operation of the airplane, but maintenance has an equally high priority role in the safe operation of any aircraft.
To keep airplanes in peak condition, they get more health checks than most passengers.
It is a very intricately weaved web between the operation of the airplane and the maintenance of the airplane and the management of the airplane.
Passenger planes are examined every time they come to a stop. This is the A check. A brief walk-around inspection stands up the most obvious problems. The more intensive work is done at set intervals. These are the B and C checks. Tonight, workers are performing a C check. From start to finish, it can require hundreds of man-hours of work. It all has to get finished tonight, so the plane is back flying in the morning. It's a massive challenge, because model jets are made of hundreds of thousands of individual pieces. In 1903, when the Wright brothers took their historic first flights near Kitty Hawk, North Carolina. Their plane had some 1,500 parts. A 737 has more than 316,000.
You have to ensure that every one of those components is doing its respective job. It doesn't matter how big the part is, missing a screw can jeopardize the safety of flight.
It's a lesson the aviation industry has learned the hard way. January 31st, 2010. On board Alaska Airlines Flight 261, the situation is desperate. Operating a damaged plane, the captain is trying to land at Los Angeles Airport. If the aircraft is not responding to control, the MD-83 is plunging towards the Pacific Ocean. Other pilots flying nearby report the nightmare scene back to LA Air Traffic Control.
Yes, he's definitely another down position. I think my radar was definitely out of control. Plane is burning, sir. Okay. Yeah, he's a bit of... Who's on the other side? Here we go. And he just hit the water. Yeah, the water is down.
Flight 261 crashed off the coast of California at over 400 kilometers an hour. All 88 passengers and crew are killed. Investigators from the National Transportation Safety Board begin their work quickly. The cockpit voice recordings provide some of the earliest clues.
Jam stabilizer maintaining altitude with difficulty.
We immediately suspected some problem in the tail of the airplane, which is where the controls are. Something was wrong back there.
Investigators examine the MD-83's horizontal stabilizer. The stabilizer controls the plane's pitch, its ability to tilt up and down. As the stabilizer moves up, the plane's nose tilts down. As the stabilizer moves down, the nose moves up. In the MD-83, a motorized jack screw on the tail moves the stabilizer up and down. When investigators recover the tail from the crash site,
The jack screw wasn't mated with the nut that it screws into. It was just by itself. And the nut was found in another piece of structure a few feet away from where the jack screw was. To have a screw separate itself from a nut with very thick threads surprised us.
Without the jack screw, the stabilizer was beyond control. Without the stabilizer, the plane was doomed. The investigators very quickly figured out how the accident happened. Now they want to know why. The answer is tragically simple.
There was no lubrication or physical grease on the working area of the screw. That was surprising and strange.
The Federal Aviation Administration orders an immediate check on all MD-80s in the USA. At Alaska Airlines, the jack screws on 6 of its fleet of 34 MD-80s fail inspection. Investigators discover even more alarming evidence as they go through the carrier's maintenance records. Mechanics at Alaska Airlines report that they are under tremendous pressure to cut corners to keep the planes flying.
We interviewed all mechanics who had worked on these airplanes. We knew that they had been falsifying records or not doing the work they had indicated.
To survive an economic recession in the 1990s, Alaska Airlines slashed their maintenance regime.
With air carriers, especially those that may be economically strapped, they're going to stretch inspection cycles to the maximum. The FAR's, the Federal Aviation Regulation, set a minimum level of safety.
Now, if you're going to operate on a shoestring, you're only going to meet that minimum level of safety. If I'm a good carrier, or I want to be a good carrier, and I want to show that we're going to operate at the highest levels of safety, I'm going to typically exceed the minimum. It's going to cost more, but I'm going to exceed it. A lot of companies that say, wait, the regulations only say I only have to go to here, that's what I'm going to do.
Jack screws in the company's fleet have been inspected every 500 to 700 flight hours. But in 1996, to cut costs, Alaska Airlines began checking the jack screws every 2,500 hours. At the same time, they doubled the average daily use of their fleet.
If you have 600 hours between inspection points and greasing points, we have no chance of ever having a metal-to-metal contact situation. But if you put that out for 2,000 hours or 2,500 hours, now what you do is feed into some of these protective stages, these barriers that we have towards catastrophic failure.
Proper maintenance becomes even more critical when there's no backup to a component. On the MD-83, there was no alternative to jack screw fail. So proper maintenance was a matter of life and death.
Brilliant.
But in the aviation industry, it's also a matter of dollars and cents.
There's a lot of pressure in the airline industry when you look at it, whether you're hauling boxes or hauling people. The fact of the matter is that competition is stiff. And how do you get the competitive advantage against the next guy? How am I going to get more for less? And a lot of times it's labor, the other time it's maintenance. If I can stretch the inspection to 500 hours instead of 400 hours, that saves me a lot of money.
To stay afloat financially, Alaska Airlines put countless lives at risk. But disaster can erupt even when an airline doesn't cut back on its maintenance regime. It's past midnight in Phoenix, Arizona. A maintenance crew works through a 737-700. They're performing a so-called C check, one of the most detailed inspections any plane can go through.
We work out overnight, so then when the people come and fly it. It's better for the airline to think they're going to go overnight and pick them up.
Tonight, 339 individual inspections are set to be made. Each one of these is tracked by computer. Anything that comes up yellow is an unscheduled procedure, a problem that's just been spotted.
Unscheduled maintenance are those kinds of things typically that people will experience with their car where they're driving down the highway and all of a sudden the air conditioner doesn't work. Well, the same with an airplane.
Tonight, the inspectors discover a tire on one of the main landing gears is worn out. They add it to the list of unscheduled maintenance items. It has to be replaced before the plane goes back into service.
Obviously, the stakes are extremely high. Every night we come to work and try to do our best job possible. Make sure things are working order so people get to where they need to go.
But sometimes, despite all the maintenance, the worst-case scenario comes true. A simple repair can unexpectedly lead to disaster. August the 13th, 1985, Mount Osutaka, Japan. This is the wreckage from the deadliest single-plane disaster in aviation history. JAL Flight 123 crashed the night before, killing 520 passengers and crew. Only 4 people survived. Because the 747 jet was built in the United States, the National Transportation Safety Board joined the investigation.
When I arrived in Tokyo, the atmosphere in Japan was extremely stressful. The news media was everywhere. There was a tremendous amount of anger.
Soon after the crash, experts get a helping hand from an amateur photographer. He managed to take a picture of the 747 minutes before it crashed. The picture revealed that JAL Flight 123 was flying without its massive tail fin. The tail fin houses critical control surfaces, like the rudder, as well as tubes that carry the hydraulic fluids. What force could be strong enough to tear off the tail fin? Digging through the 747's maintenance history, investigators discover that 7 years earlier, the jet had landed with its nose too high. The tail hit the ground and scraped along the runway. The rear part of the plane had to be repaired, including the pressure bulkhead. Japan Airlines called in Boeing technicians to help repair the cracked bulkhead. After this unscheduled maintenance, the 747 was given a clean bill of health and flew for another 7 years. But this bulkhead becomes a prime suspect for the investigators.
So we had an idea that we wanted to find the rear plane bulkhead because we had a flight attendant who had been interviewed that described an explosion in the back of the airplane and she could see out. So we wanted to focus on the bulkhead.
During his investigation, Schleid finds a piece of the panel that had been spliced into the bulkhead 7 years before. The mystery of Flight 123 is solved. The 747 went down because of a faulty repair.
The repair had in fact not been done correctly. There was only one row of rivets holding that joint together, where there should have been 2 rows of rivets holding the joint together.
With only 1 row of rivets straining to hold the repaired panel in place. This was a disaster waiting to happen. Especially because this was such a busy jet.
This particular airplane was used in Japan in a domestic operation, so it made multiple takeoffs and landings on domestic operations, unlike most 747s that make long-range hauls. So this was considered a high-cycle airplane.
Investigators calculate that with the repair job, the bulkhead would survive approximately 10,000 flights or cycles. But on the day of the crash, the 747 had already racked up over 12,000 cycles. On 747 jets, the cabin is pressurized, but not the tail. During flight, the pressurized cabin air presses against the repaired bulkhead. After some 12,000 cycles, this pressure stretched the faulty repair to breaking point. The highly pressurized air blasted into the hollow tail fin and blew it off. Losing part of the tail crippled the plane's hydraulic systems.
One 747 had 4 independent hydraulic systems for powered systems, so it had quadruple redundancy. Unfortunately, these 4 lines came together in the lower part of the spar, and when separated, it sheared those 4 lines. All 4 hydraulic systems were depleted.
For some 30 minutes, the crew tried to fly their 747 using only thrust. This is like trying to drive a car using only the accelerator. No steering wheel, no brakes. Despite their heroic efforts, it was a losing battle. All this death and destruction boils down to a missing row of rivets. Why has the growing metal fatigue in the bulkhead remained undetected through 7 years of scheduled maintenance and inspections?
But the primary inspection method for the bulkhead area and the seams was a visual inspection. And at heavy maintenance periods when they would take the insulation out off the walls and everything and off the bulkhead, they would do a detailed visual inspection.
And during subsequent maintenance checks, the faulty repair was never found. Two decades after JAL Flight 123, airlines are constantly looking for hidden flaws that aren't visible from the outside. Back at the Southwest maintenance hangar, inspectors are using a borescope, a tiny flexible camera, to inspect the engines. Engines are the heart of passenger planes. If they stop working, pilots don't have the option of pulling over to the side of the road.
Oh, there we go. Looking for cracks. looking at the blades, the rotor blades, and looking for missing material off of them. You know, any hot spots that have worn through the metal, cracks, radial and axial cracks.
Any kind of crack or trace of metal fatigue in any of the fan blades could spell disaster.
Kick off check, put on the line. Okay, then let's.
August the 21st, 1995. Atlantic Southeast Airlines Flight 529, an Embraer Brasilia, is about to take off with 29 people on board. It's bound for Gulfport, Mississippi.
It was, at the time, the fastest, sleekest turboprop around.
Before the plane even reaches its cruising altitude, something seems to explode outside.
The sound of that was tremendous. It was as if someone had taken a baseball bat and hit an aluminum garbage can as hard as they could. It was the gigantic crashing sound. The airplane immediately lurched to the left.
No matter what the flight crew tries to do, the plane pulls violently to the left.
Over there.
Captain and co-pilot are pushed to the brink of their experience.
Here. Help me. Help me. Help me. Hold it. Help me. Hold it.
Atlantic Southeast Flight 529 crashes near the small farming community of Carrollton, Georgia.
Yes, we have a plane crashed in our backyard. A plane crash?
All 29 people survive the violent landing. But 10 passengers eventually die from their injuries. Called into action, the NTSB creates teams to examine various parts of the plane. Space engineer is in charge of the propeller maintenance group.
We came along a lot of pieces of the wing, came along the propeller assembly that was missing one part of the blade.
The blade broke in a very specific fashion, leaving behind all the telltale signs of a fatigue fracture.
A fatigue fracture tends to be a very flat fracture. It also has what we call feedbacks radiating out from the origin. So you see these radiating eccentric rings coming from the origin of the crack.
Hookie had good reason to focus on the broken propeller blade. 17 months before ASA 529, identical propeller blades broke on separate flights over Canada and Brazil. Fortunately, in both cases, the aircraft managed to land safely. The manufacturer of the propeller was Hamilton Standard. Hookie and his team start combing through Hamilton Standard's maintenance records. They're looking for anything out of the ordinary.
It's whatever's abnormal. You really don't know what you're looking for until you find it. But you just go through, and there's a lot of routine maintenance is done, regular inspections, A checks, B checks, C checks, and then there's the non-routine maintenance that's occurred if something is broken or a truck hits the airplane or they have a bird strike or something like that. And it's those that you look for.
The maintenance records reveal that the broken propeller blade had earlier problems.
We found out that the propeller blade had actually been removed from service once already for a crack indication. And that became the first clue about there may be a problem with that propeller blade and those inspections.
Deep inside the hollow propeller, investigators find what they're looking for. In the hollow interior, or taper board, Weights are inserted to balance the prop. They're kept in place by a cork. This simple cork was the trigger in a deadly chain of events.
About 95% of the cork that's produced in the world is used by the medical industry. And for aesthetic purposes and for sterilization, they like to have the light color. So the cork is bleached with chlorine.
The NTSB discovers that moisture inside the propeller caused the chlorine in the cork to leach out and corrode the propeller's aluminium alloy. They also noticed something else on the broken blade. On the inner surface, extending about 4 centimeters from the fracture, there are a series of sanding marks. Going through the blade's repair records, Cookie notices the initials CSB, Christopher Scott Bender. This technician worked at a Hamilton Standard repair facility. When Christopher Bender watches news of the accident, he learns that the investigators are examining the Hamilton propeller.
And as soon as I heard that, my heart just sank. I was like, yeah, I think I might even cry a little bit. I was just, just emotionally overwhelmed that something I had put my hands on, the procedure somebody trusted me to do failed, because of somebody died.
After discovering that it was Bender who last worked on the deadly propeller blade, the NTSB now has to find out how the blade had passed inspection at Hamilton Standard. Investigators asked Bender to perform his standard maintenance technique on the propeller.
He demonstrated how he would go down into the barrel of the taper bore with a fiber optic borescope and look for cracks. And therein lied one of the primary problems. The borescope that he was using had a bright white light that would put a lot of glare back into the inspector's eyes. It really did not lend itself to the inspection that was required.
And investigators also find a gap in Bender's training.
He had never been shown what a crack would look like. He was just told to find a crack, and he would look for a crack.
When he was examining the propeller blade, Bender had been unable to detect any evidence of corrosion. He then did what he'd been told to do, polish the inside of the blade.
He was given a directive to use a repair to blend out the inside of the taper bore. He blended it out, he did an inspection, and the blending that he had done had roughened the surface, so it actually masked the indication of the crack in the subsequent inspection. And the blade was returned to service, where the crack continued to propagate until it ultimately reached critical length and separated.
The draft accident report we present to you today involves Atlantic Southeast Airlines Flight 529.
According to the NTSB, by polishing the blade, Hamilton Standard had unwittingly removed all traces of the crack. Even a later, more thorough ultrasound examination could not detect it. The company that manufactured Flight 529 propeller is now renamed Hamilton Sunstrand. Its inspection and repair process was made more stringent, in some cases exceeding FAA requirements. Flight 529 was the last time one of its propellers failed in flight.
I wish this had never happened. I wish I could go back in time and fix it and take care of it, that it didn't happen.
Out of the thousands of parts on board an Embraer Brasilia, a simple small cork was the key to a horrific accident. ASA Flight 529 underlines the critical need for proper maintenance. But sometimes maintenance can create the potential for disaster when a new component is installed into an older airplane.
Parking center, Super 111 Heavy is clearing pan, we have smoke in the cockpit.
It's early morning in Phoenix, Arizona. Southwest Airlines engineers are continuing their scheduled maintenance of a 737. Southwest is unique among larger airlines. It flies just one kind of plane, the 737. Tonight, engineers are working on a 700 model, one of the newest 737s. But the company's very first 300 model, bought in the mid-1980s, is still flying.
You can still operate an old airplane as long as you have inspection protocols. When you look at some of the cargo carriers, they're operating airplanes that are 30 and 40 and even 50 years old. They're still reliable airplanes. They've been maintained, they've been retrofitted with modern-day equipment.
Updating older planes is a standard part of maintenance. But sometimes installing a new component in an older plane can lead to tragedy. Inside this makeshift lab are the shattered remains of Swissair Flight 111. On September the 2nd, 1998, the passenger jet crashed off the coast of Nova Scotia, Canada, killing everyone on board. Recovered from the seabed, the debris is overwhelming. There is almost 250 kilometers of wiring alone.
In Swissair, we've had about 2 million pieces of airplane, and we pretty much almost had to look at them all.
In the business, we refer to often finding the golden nugget. That's saying, aha, there's the cause of the accident.
Somewhere in this wreckage, investigators hope to find that golden nugget. The one piece that will reveal the reason why Swissair 111 crashed into the Atlantic Ocean. The cockpit voice recorder gives investigators their first critical clues.
You smell something? Yeah, what is that? We'll have a look, I'll take it. Roger, good, patrol.
The first officer checks the area around the air conditioning vent. Nothing seems right.
I don't see anything, nurse. There's nothing up there now.
Captain Zimmerman is troubled by the smell of smoke.
Yeah.
He starts to divert the plane to the nearest airport.
Pilot suspect announced.
He radios air traffic control in Malta, New Brunswick.
Swissair 111 Heavy is declaring pan. We have smoke in the cockpit.
Pan is an international term used to notify air traffic control of an urgent situation. It's one step below declaring Mayday.
I guess Boston,
Swissair 111 is directed to Halifax and starts its descent.
Okay, can I vector you set up for runway 06 at Melbourne?
The pilots appear calm and in control. Halifax is just 20 minutes away.
They want us to turn to the south.
At that point, everything was normal. I gave the pilot an initial descent, and he requested to level off at an intermediate altitude to get the cabin ready for the landing, which took to mean that they needed to pack away dinner trays and things like that.
Cabin buzz off! Cabin buzz off, Roger.
But the seemingly controlled situation on board Swissair Flight 111 escalates into a full-scale emergency.
Autopilot disconnect! We're declaring emergency now!
Spaceship. Oops. Oh.
Shortly after declaring an emergency, the plane goes silent.
It was probably one of the most helpless feelings that any individual can have, not being able to do anything but just sit and watch the target and hope that it would turn back toward the airport. And of course it didn't.
At 10:31 p.m. Atlantic time, residents of Peggy's Cove hear a devastating explosion. From the cockpit voice recorder, investigators know they're dealing with a fire and not a plane that was malfunctioning.
We found no anomalies or no problems in any of that flight data that suggested there was a problem with the aircraft.
Investigators work their way through the hangar of wreckage recovered from the Atlantic Ocean. Finally, they find scorch marks, which reveal that the source of the fire was in the back of the cockpit, directly behind the first officer.
Двери ставят.
Following this trail leads the team to an unlikely suspect, the entertainment system in first class. The Swissair MD-11s provided first class with one of the world's most sophisticated entertainment systems. Passengers in first class could choose their own movies, access the internet, and even gamble. This entertainment system was not part of the original MD-11 design.
The system had some major deficiencies. It was getting very hot. It drew a lot of power. And thereby, for example, raising the cabin temperature.
Uh-oh.
They did not install a simple oxygen.
Или маме надо раньше, а тут тоже.
Appropriate cooling system.
Холодно не было еще.
Anytime you have an electrical system where you're putting...
Сейчас проверю, надо, не надо. Не пришло, не пришло.
You run the risk.
Да, пришло.
The integrity of the aircraft itself as it was originally designed.
When informed about the flaw in the wiring, Swissair immediately disabled the entertainment system of the rest of its fleet. But investigators discover that another piece of the jet had helped the fire spread with alarming speed.
In this instance, we did discover a wire that arced in that way, and right next to it was some very flammable material called vaporized polyethylene terephthalate covering material that covers the insulation.
Да, 16, 23 часа.
This polyethylene insulate was common on commercial airlines around the world. It had somehow passed the industry's flammability tests, which required materials to self-extinguish after a reasonable period of time.
This thermoacoustical material that was in this aircraft was very flammable, even though it passed the test. It does sustain and it does propagate flame.
The fire spread quickly from the cockpit back into the first-class galleys. Some metals showed heat damage from temperatures as high as 1100 degrees Fahrenheit. Less than 12 minutes after the crew declared a pan-pan, the fire disabled all electronics in the cockpit. In the aftermath, Swissair removed the flammable insulate from its entire the rest of the industry was required to follow suit. In Phoenix, Arizona, flight engineers continue their sea check on the 737. It includes testing the plane's rudder. The rudder is one of the jet's most vital control surfaces. It allows a plane to
Просто вверх поднять, и все.
A problem here could have terrifying consequences. In fact, despite years of proper maintenance, a problem with a tiny component of the 737 rudder killed more than 100 people. Not even the most diligent maintenance workers could have spotted it. March the 3rd, 1991. United Flight 5 begins its final approach into Colorado Springs.
7, 8. Это часа 2. Они не сразу.
All 20 passengers and 5 crew are killed. Investigators from the National Transportation Safety Board descend on Colorado Springs.
My first sense that it was going to take some time to investigate the accident was the damage that we saw.
An aerospace engineer by training, Greg Phillips is in charge of investigating United 585's flight control systems.
Ce ne sembra, bello.
We focused in after eliminating other flight control services that we thought could contribute to the role. We started looking at the rudder.
But investigators face a critical obstacle. Most of the plane's parts are too crushed or burned for testing. Luckily, one vital component is still reasonably intact. This is the power control unit, PCU. Used constantly during flight, especially during landings, the PCU performs like a car with skill. When the pilot pushes on the rudder pedal, the PCU uses hydraulic fluid to convert the gentle movements of a pilot's foot into the pressure needed to move the 737.
Guarda, causa una fungo.
The heart of the PCU is the dual servo valve. This valve is roughly the size of a soda can. It contains two extremely thin slides that glide past one another. These slides direct the flow of hydraulic fluid which moves the rudder.
Не забыл. Взял не те. Еще запасные. Две пары.
It seems to be in working order.
We didn't have any absolute indication or information that we could point to that said the rudder control unit, the servo valve, or any part of that flight control system caused that accident.
Не спешите задуматься в один пore.
For only the fourth time in its history, the NTSB releases a report that does not reach a conclusion.
I think we put a lot of time
Оказываем уже.
into the investigation, and we just weren't sure what had happened.
А паска мне уже третий год, уже 3 года.
Phillips and the NTSB would be brought back to the mysterious
Уже 3 года.
crash of another 737.
3 года играю как. Уже 3 года. 4-й, ну на следующий будет 4 года.
September the 8th, 1994. US Air Flight 427 has crashed near Pittsburgh, killing everyone on board.
When we first arrived,
Ну давай, блин, давай.
there were only bits and pieces of the airplane. It wasn't really recognizable as an airplane.
Investigators begin to see that this crash is a mirror image of United Flight 585. On final approach, United while US Air
Кирюбки еще, блин. Кто такие ставят? Они мешают. Вот это.
After a terrifying struggle, both crash with no survivors.
Сюда? А, это сюда.
Once again, investigators test the dual servo.
Да, это на улицу.
But they come up empty-handed.
That unit passed all its operational tests. There wasn't any indication that it failed. We were going up against an aircraft that had incredible safety. It was really everything you could see for 30 years. This has been a great airplane. We were trying to prove that there was something wrong.
Жарковато, конечно, этот был. Что что-то там как-то не...
But almost 2 years later, they get a third chance to solve this deadly mystery. In Phoenix, Arizona, a long maintenance is winding down. Over 30 mechanics and some half a dozen inspectors have flown through a Southwest Airlines 737. The team has made more than 400 separate checks. Parts have been replaced. Southwest 737 N47WN is almost ready to fly again.
Hopefully, it pushed back on the hangar. Do some big check, make sure everything's working. Nothing's leaking. They never go to the gate or the pressure tank.
But it's a truth in maintenance that engineers can only fix what they know is broken. For several years, every 737 that flew had a hidden danger that not even the most careful technician could have spotted. In the early 1990s, two 737s crashed in mysterious accidents. In both cases, the jets spiraled out of control. In 1996, the same malfunction strikes again. It's June the 9th. Captain Brian Bishop prepares to land in Richmond, Virginia. Then, just like United 585 and US Air 427, its plane rolls out of control.
I tried to go the opposite direction and stood on the opposite rudder pedal. The pedal didn't move for me. We didn't know to what extent, but we knew we had a problem with the rudder.
For over 30 seconds, Bishop struggles to control his renegade plane. And then, just as suddenly, the 737 calms down and goes back to horizontal.
We had started the checklist. Almost before I could finish the sentence, all of a sudden there was a wham.
The 737 is once again out of control. Then, out of the blue, East Wind 517 is back on track. Wasting no time, Captain Bishop gets it onto the tarmac.
Actually, doing this is when I realized my way was mistaken.
We launched to the sea. The airplane literally didn't move. Stayed at its location, the airport, until we got down there.
Suddenly they had a 737 that had had a rudder incident that was intact, and they had a pilot who was alive and could talk about it.
I think they were much happier to have the airplane than me.
Investigators zero in on the 737's rudder controls. The power control unit is tested again and again, but it performs perfectly. Refusing to give up, investigator Tom Houter decides to try a different test.
One fellow mentioned a test they'd done in the military of a thermal shock.
The power control unit is soaked in dry ice and blasted with nitrogen gas at minus 40 degrees Celsius. Then it's injected with superheated hydraulic fluid. It's then given a command to start working.
As we were standing there listening to the actuator move left and right, it stopped. And it was not commanded to stop.
It just jammed. Stopped working completely.
The team has discovered that a small hydraulic valve that controls the rudder of the world's most popular jetliner can jam in the right circumstances. And the valve can jam without leaving behind any traces. When investigators double-check their results, they discover another major flaw.
Careful analysis of the data, coupled the engineers recognized that it not only stopped working, but actually left became right and right became left. There was actually a movement of fluid into places that it shouldn't have gone. And the reversal is like driving your car. You turn to the right, it goes left. You're not going to figure out this failure mode until you go off the road. And in these cases, that's what the pilots were faced with, something so unusual that they didn't understand what was happening.
He can't keep his foot on the rudder pedal because he's thinking, why isn't the plane going right? And he's feeling the plane go to the left.
In the aftermath of these disasters, pilots received better training on how to deal with sudden rudder problems. Boeing spent hundreds of millions of dollars redesigning and replacing the rudder's dual servo valve on thousands of 737s around the world.
One thing we don't like in the safety board
is to have undetermined accident, because then we can't make a change to improve safety. So out of US Air 427, United 585, we have a much safer 737.
It's 7 a.m. After an 8-hour shift, the maintenance is finished on this Southwest Airlines 737. According to their maintenance reports, the team has conducted 78 unscheduled procedures and 339 scheduled inspections.
I think each one of us out here has a sense of pride in themselves that we do the best job we possibly can day in, day out. Obviously, the stakes are high. Every life is important.
Despite the horror of airplane disasters, they're still extremely rare. Especially given how often passenger planes take off and land.
Sometimes we obscure the fact that we fly millions and millions and millions of people day in and day out without putting a scratch on even the airplane, let alone the people. This is the most amazing system.
This system depends on the dedicated team of professionals committed to taking care of these 21st century masterpieces. Planes so well built that they could fly almost as long as we're willing to take care of them.
We've learned now how to inspect and maintain these things and even rebuild them to where they should have an indefinite life. They're built tough and they should be able to last forever if they're maintained properly.
Every time you board a plane, you put your trust in the pilots. And every time pilots enter the cockpit, they put their trust in computers. It's a complicated relationship between man and machine. And when it doesn't work perfectly, disaster can strike in an instant.
We didn't know if we were going to live or die.
Life and death decisions have to be made in a moment. Confusion can kill passengers and crew.
Flying in today's world is
Аж
a
на 7.
complex task. The pilot's always the last line of defense.
When the worst happens, the question is, who's flying the plane? It's just after 8:30 in the morning in Sanford, Florida. These student pilots walk out to ground school. Their topic today, a Cirrus SR-20.
We can tell just from looking at it exactly the lights.
Every year, dozens of students enroll at the Delta Connection Academy, hoping to eventually become pilots with major airlines.
Я сам не задумал,
Their
он не
lives,
раз.
and one day the lives of the passengers they fly, depend on their deep understanding of their airplane.
From this side, right here, you can see the propeller governor.
The majority of our students come to us with zero or very little flight training. We want to run someone through our entire program and end up placing them with one of the regional carriers.
The
Он
wings
кинул
here
сегодня.
are called corner units.
Спокойно.
They help reduce the induced drag.
These flight students are getting started on smaller aircraft. In the years to come, they will move into large commercial jets boasting the latest in technology.
Красота это.
When you go back to the right roads, they had no automation. Everything was by muscle power, other than a small internal combustion engine.
Ну, все потом, оно все равно еще не очень. Еще нет. Еще нет.
But in the last 100 years, technology has revolutionized flying. pilots share the cockpit with automated computer systems that control virtually every aspect of flight.
It can do everything else up to and including land the airplane. Everything is set so that autopilots and
Можно крыло сделать.
are tools for the pilot to use, but they're not replaced.
А, с этого.
It's a
Маленькая
critical
смыка.
lesson for stupid pilots to learn. Safe flight is a balance between automation and training. If a pilot makes a mistake, or if an instrument malfunctions, these flying computers can turn into lethal machines that can't be controlled. October the 2nd, 1996. Aero Peru Flight 603 prepares for takeoff for Santiago, Chile. The plane is a 4-year-old Boeing 757, a highly sophisticated jet known for its reliability and safety.
Раз, два, три, пять. Еще две.
The 757 is flown by two of the national airline's best
Три.
pilots. Captain Eric Schreiber and First Officer David Fernandez. There are 61 passengers and 9 crew members on board. The jet is among a new generation of computer-controlled aircraft in which pilots are trained to rely on a central data system that is designed to reduce errors, both mechanical and human. Gear up. Tonight, within minutes of takeoff, the flight begins to go horribly wrong.
The altimeter is there.
The altimeter indicates how high the aircraft is flying over the ground. It reads 0, but the plane is clearly airborne.
This is really new. Keep B2 plus 10.
The 757 is equipped with 3 altimeters. One for the pilot, one for the co-pilot, and one for backup. All 3 seem to be dead. As the two men try to solve the first problem, they lose another. The airspeed indicator.
The speed. Hold it. Maintain speed.
Bewildered by the host of confusing warnings, Captain Schreiber decides to land.
Lima Tower, Aero Peru 603. We are in an emergency. Aero Peru 603, Lima. We are declaring an emergency. We have no basic instruments, no altimeter, no airspeed indicator. Declaring emergency.
To add to their problems, Schreiber and Fernandez are flying at night over water with no visual reference points. Not being able to trust their instruments, the pilots are flying blind.
The airplane is controlled. But you first have to diagnose what's wrong. It's very easy. 20/20 hindsight, sitting here in a chair, a nice sunny day. You say, this is what he should have done. But in the cold, dark night, with bells and whistles going off, it's very difficult to analyze conflicting information that you're getting.
Unable to trust their instruments, the pilots have to depend on information from the ground.
Can you give us the airspeed, please, if you have us on the radar?
Yes. At about 10 seconds, it seems that you're climbing at level 6,000, 22 miles south, on heading 195.
Okay, we left. We're on heading 190, and we have 7,000 feet on the altimeter.
Express, so now reaching 7,000. Even as they try to return to the airport, the havoc in the cockpit gets worse. Systems warn that they're overspeed.
Overspeed.
They're flying too fast.
Extend the speed, Greg.
Now the stall warning sounds. And then,
What's happening? Too low terrain. We have the terrain alarm. We have the terrain alarm.
the ground proximity alarm warns them that they're flying dangerously low. Flight level 10,000 over the sea.
There is no checklist for if you have these 7 or 8 warnings going off, which they did, and they couldn't shut them off.
visual reference? The crew is bombarded with conflicting warnings. They have no idea which of them to believe. Suddenly, they realize the horrible truth. We're heading over! They're flying just meters above the water. Aero Peru 603, Lima. There are no survivors from Flight 603. All because something caused the onboard computers to go haywire. Searching through the Pacific waters, investigators managed to find the data recorders.
It was clear to us that what they were really experiencing a problem with airspeed and altitude.
On the 757, devices called pitot-static tubes measure the airspeed and altitude. They're small external sensors which relay that information to the plane's computerized systems. Deep underwater, tape is discovered covering the plane's sensors. How the tape got there leads investigators back to the maintenance crew at Lima Airport. Just before Aero Peru 603 lifted off from Lima, maintenance workers had cleaned the jet. A worker had covered the static ports with tape to protect them. This is standard procedure. But when the maintenance was complete, the worker forgot to remove the tape. It was a small oversight with tragic results.
The inspector who was supposed to quality check his work did not do it. And the supervisor out on the line that night was not there. He was sick, and there was a regular mechanic who was filling that role. He did not see it. In this case, the captain did the pre-flight. They do a walk around looking for just that kind of thing. The captain did the pre-flight that night, and he did not detect it either.
Yes, correct. We're now reaching 7,000. The blocked tubes also explain why the air traffic controllers told the crew they were flying at 7,000 feet. The information on the plane's height isn't calculated by radar on the ground, but by the plane's onboard systems. From 7,000 feet, the plane began to slowly descend, but the onboard systems couldn't detect it. Distances, and the air traffic controller had no way to know the altitude indicated on his system was wrong. 4360. Blindsided by the bewildering readings from their instruments, the crew was completely lost. They had no idea where they were, how high they were flying, or how fast they were going. Fly Aero 603, if you need to, pull up. Aero Peru was a deadly lesson about how dependent pilots have become on their automated flight systems, and how helpless they can be when the systems are crippled. Student pilots need to understand the complex technology at the heart of their airplanes. When something goes wrong, they need to know who's in control. Because even an experienced pilot can rely too heavily on his systems. And when he does, disaster can be just seconds away.
Right, gentlemen, what we're going to do today is practice projectile takeoffs in preparation for the D1 cuts. It'll be engine fire, engine failure, or loss of directional control.
At the Delta Connection Flight School in Sanford, Florida, students are facing the worst in the safety of a simulator. No pilot can graduate unless they can deal with problems they may never have to face in the real world.
The course that I teach, we typically, they work as a crew and they'll get 26 hours in the simulator, 13 hours in each seat.
Simulation can now introduce problems that are hard to introduce in the air. Doing it with simulation allows it to be repeated, and then if you are ever faced with the emergency, it becomes almost a matter of routine.
Connection 500, you're clear for takeoff.
Clear for takeoff, runway 46500.
Right after takeoff, the students are faced with an emergency.
When you get one of those warnings, don't just punch it out, but then acknowledge it so both pilots are on the same page.
Alright. You have a left engine below pressure.
They run through the drill again and again, because surviving in the air depends on getting it right in the simulator. In an actual cockpit, even a small inconvenience can escalate into a desperate struggle to save the airplane. February the 19th, 1985, China Airlines Flight 006 is tumbling through the sky. One of the engines has failed. The instruments seem to be making no sense.
People just popped up like popcorn, hitting the cabin. We didn't know if we were going to live or die.
The 747 falls more than 10 kilometers in 2 minutes. The pilots can barely keep it airborne.
You know, this airplane is totally out of control. It is going to crash.
The jet nosedives towards the Pacific Ocean. Then, just moments away from impact, the crew regains control of the plane.
Brooklyn Center, Dynasty 006. Returning an emergency.
Dynasty 006, Oakland Center, you are now clear. You are free to descend at pilot's discretion.
After surviving a tremendous fall, Captain Min Yun Ho makes a smooth, textbook landing.
I thought he was a hero. He saved our life. And we thought he was a hero and everything was fine.
24 passengers have suffered minor injuries. One crew member is hospitalized and soon released. But the 747 looks like it's been through a war zone.
Parts of the entire airplane at the end were ripped off, as though a tornado had come through, or a crane had been in and ripped pieces out of it.
Investigators soon realized the damage to the plane wasn't the cause of the problems, but had actually occurred during the plane's wild plunge. They pore through maintenance records and flight logs to try to determine the cause of the near-fatal incident. Inside the plane, investigators find a worn valve. It led directly to the failure of the jet's fourth engine. But this shouldn't have caused the plane to fall through the sky.
Engine fourth, laying down.
The loss of thrust on a four-engine airplane is an it's an event. You have to take care of it, but the airplane will fly through the minutes with no difficulty.
I do not think I was.
The captain
это я еще делал этот
while
пазл.
the crew was dealing with the faulty engine, he left the autopilot in control of the plane. But on this 747, the autopilot does not
Все сделал.
rudder. Autopilots are set to maintain.
Я еще делал.
If something
Да,
goes
еще.
wrong, the system tries to respond. With more engine power on the left wing, the China Airlines jet began turning right.
Очки все.
The autopilot reacted by using the
Нормально
plane's
все.
ailerons to try to keep the 747.
Сизим надо. Буду ехать в кино, зарядку.
The jet kept turning.
Сейчас прохладновато, сейчас не жарко.
The proper thing to do would have been to step on the rudder. Now, it's possible that he'd forgotten that the autopilot
Задолбало.
He may have been assuming all along that the autopilot was just flying the airplane away
Вообще.
from the beam.
Спокойно стоит. Вообще холодно.
Focused on his malfunctioning engine, Captain Ho left the auto.
Это уже было.
But without the help of the rudder, the ailerons were losing their battle to keep the plane level.
Опять шестой сезон. Седьмой уже. Я уже видел.
639 pieces of wreckage recovered from the sea.
Он повторяется.
639 pieces that only deepen the mystery of a deadly plane crash.
A little bit more to the right. There.
But when investigators bring up the 640th piece of China Airlines Flight 611, they get their answer.
There was definitely a Eureka-moment on the dock.
It would be scrutinized more closely than any other piece of debris. On this single piece of wreckage, investigators would find the one clue that would tell them why a modern jetliner with 225
Ты тупая, Валерий.
shattered in midair.
Ты тупая. Вернулся звонок. Куда его? Я знаю, его на ус ставить надо. Сюда его.
You feel that?
Два? Это два? А это один. Или... Ноль?
A China Airlines 747 lifts off from Taiwan.
Один, два, ноль. Чего? Что за бред? Цифры. Что за бред?
Dynasty 611. Autopilot engage.
Три? Чего, блин?
Airlines is Taiwan's national airline. There are 225 people on board Flight 611.
Один.
Today's flight is a short one, 1 hour and 40 minutes across the Taiwan Strait to Hong Kong. This route is one of the most
Номер дома.
It makes so much money, it's called the Golden Route.
Ladies and gentlemen, the fasten seatbelt sign has been turned off. For your safety, we do recommend that you keep your seatbelt fastened at all times while seated.
Теперь тут это сделать.
Minutes after taking off, Flight 611 climbs steadily above the Taiwan Strait.
Выкинь перо.
The plane's autopilot controls the ascent. And then, 20 minutes after taking off, at an altitude of almost 35,000 feet,
Isn't that bad?
the flight vanishes from radar.
Dynasty 611, Taipei.
Твой лимит.
Dynasty 611, Taipei. I've got a plane off radar. China Airlines 611. Its last known return was east 119.67, north 23.98.
Taiwanese authorities quickly launched one of the largest rescue missions in that country's aviation history.
本时段被情同仁，本时段被情同仁，请立即至值班室集合。这里蛮高的。海顺动幺，海顺动幺高架的，高架的，引导吧。同时下达。
I gave a clear order. that the priority would be searching for whoever was still alive, then bodies, and then, only then, wreckage.
More than 1,000 people take part. Fishing boats, the Coast Guard, and Taiwan's military race out to sea. Flight 611 was 55 kilometers from the Taiwanese shore, just north of the Penghu Island where it disappeared. Rescuers find debris floating in the Taiwan Strait.
First thing we saw was a great amount of wreckage, including landing gear wheels, napkins, knives, forks.
Wreckage from the plane is spread far and wide. Some items are found on land more than 100 kilometers away in central Taiwan. As the rescue effort continues, Taiwan's Aviation Safety Council begins its investigation into the crash of the 22-year-old plane.
747-200 delivered August 2nd, 1979.
Kay Young is the managing director of the ASC. He'll be leading the investigation.
So we have command comes Penghu Island. Let's go.
China have had very, very poor safety record. As a matter of fact, it was considered one of the worst in the world. Typically, it has one major accident every 4 years. This particular investigation was by far the most difficult. And one of the reasons why was its emotional component.
The search for survivors goes on around the clock. There were 225 people on the airplane. Nobody is found alive. The bodies are taken to the Penghu Islands to be identified and examined. Since the accident involved an American-made plane, the NTSB joins the investigation. A team of investigators is dispatched to Taiwan. They'll be led by John DeLisi in Washington.
We have a very good working relationship with the ASC, the Aviation Safety Council of Taiwan, so we knew that they would ask for and welcome our assistance in the investigation.
Wreckage that's found floating is also brought to the Penghu Islands. Investigators need to know how one of the world's most successful planes, on one of the world's most traveled routes, simply fell out of the sky.
What's it doing? Is the world's most popular jumbo jet, and it's flown millions of people, probably billions of miles. So we're very concerned.
Good morning. I'm anxious to see what you have.
Sophisticated ground-based radar tracks Flight 611 throughout its short journey. It should provide investigators with a much clearer picture of the flight than the radar at air traffic control. Kay Young gets the first major clue in this case. The radar tracked the plane as it climbed on course to 35,000 feet. Then suddenly, the 611 signals split apart.
Right when the event happened, and scatter as they fell to the earth. So that told us that the airplane broke up in flight.
Turned their attention to finding out what caused that breakup.
There's all kind of theories about the implications of that particular aircraft. We knew that something massive had happened suddenly, without warning.
It doesn't take long for the media to consider a sinister possibility. That Flight 611 was shot down.
Still. C'est del bad.
China and Taiwan have a combative relationship. China has fired missiles towards Taiwan in the past. There's suspicion in the media that China shot down Flight 611.
There were a lot of theories about, the doors shooting down by enemy fire.
Only 8 months earlier, a Siberia Airlines flight with 78 people on board was shot down over the Black Sea. It was accidentally hit by a missile fired from Ukraine during a training exercise. On the day of the China Airlines crash, China was conducting military exercises in the Taiwan Strait. But officials there insist no missile was launched towards Flight 611. None of the wreckage recovered so far has any of the telltale signs of being hit. And there's no evidence on radar that there was ever a missile heading for Flight 611.
Once the evidence began to come in, it very quickly ruled out a missile. Much the same way that it ruled out it being a mid-air collision. There were no other objects in the air.
Few things would cause a plane to break up in mid-air. One of the big ones is a bomb. Medical examiners check the bodies that have been recovered for burn marks and shrapnel. They find none. The plane's metal skin would be torn and curled in a very particular way if there had been a bomb on board. Investigators find no such damage on any of the pieces. But to rule out the bomb, they'll have to find more wreckage.
I think that'll be it for floating wreckage.
The team from the NTSB arrives in Taiwan.
Morning, I'm Clint Brookshanks from the NTSB. Good to see you, gentlemen. I'm afraid we still don't have much.
Clint Crookshanks is a structural engineer who knows the 747 intimately.
I didn't have any preconceived notions. This was my first major accident working for the NTSB. We are not getting much from the floating debris. In-flight breakup. That's all we know.
Taiwan's Civil Aeronautics Authority doesn't take any chances. They ground all of China Airlines 747-200 series planes until they can be inspected for mechanical flaws. This puts added pressure on investigators to find out what happened.
Thank you, Stephen.
To the NTSB, this accident seems to have a lot in common with one of the world's most studied plane crashes. That of TWA Flight 800, 6 years earlier. Like the China Airlines flight, it broke into pieces while still climbing. That plane crashed into the Atlantic shortly after taking off from New York.
TWA Flight 800 was the biggest investigation the NTSB has ever done. It lasted about 4 years.
The painstaking investigation uncovered a design flaw with the 747. Wiring near one of the plane's fuel tanks could spark and ignite the fuel in the tank. Investigators conclude that's what likely caused the crash. Investigators are struck by similarities between the two flights. Both were 747s. Both disintegrated without warning while still climbing. Both flights took off in very hot weather. The heat may have caused Flight 800 to explode. That plane sat on the tarmac with its air conditioning running. Investigators believe hot air from the air conditioner overheated the plane's fuel. The early evidence is pointing to a repeat of TWA Flight 800.
So it was really very, very simple. So therefore, our immediate focus was essentially to center fuel tank.
3 weeks after the crash, the Yan Steel, a sophisticated salvage vessel, arrives in the Taiwan Strait. It's equipped with divers, a diving chamber, and a remote-operated submarine, complete with sonar and video.
NTSB are tasked with manning the recovery vessel and watching video screens from the ROV.
Что сидит отдохнуть.
Using sonar, investigators have located the
Нет, еще одна кухня. Нет, и еще одна. Я так и думал, у меня уже одна есть.
Bent Crookshanks knows all the pieces that make up a 747, but he's never seen them like this.
It was really quite a shock when I first saw pieces on the floor of the ocean. With only the lighting of the ROV, the guide would notice something that looked like an airplane part. The ROV would then circle around the part, looking at it from all angles.
Crookshank's job is to help the Taiwanese identify specific airplane parts among the wreckage.
I think it takes a different kind of
Ой, не-не-не, переборщил. Это он упал опять.
to really determine where it comes from on the airplane. A little bit more to the right. Go back. There. Okay, that's definitely a piece of wood. That's working.
Once a piece is identified, its GPS coordinates get recorded. The GPS mapping tells investigators that the debris is spread out over 325 square kilometers. It will be difficult to track down specific pieces of the plane. 25 days after the crash of Flight 611, the plane's two black boxes have been found. One contains voice recordings of conversations in the cockpit. The other, data from the plane's flight computer. Either could hold the clues that will reveal what happened during the final minutes of the flight.
Были тот момент?
If the answer is on the tape,
В 22-м.
investigators may not have to bring up more wreckage to the surface.
До отъезда.
The data is critical.
Это же в январе.
Ready? Investigators begin with the plane's cockpit voice recorder. They hope that the pilots will have said something to each other about an emergency on board.
Welcome aboard, China Airlines.
The recording begins about 10 minutes before the plane took off. Preparations for the flight sound normal.
Okay, after start checklist. After start, API.
The crew checks all their systems and runs through standard checklists.
Off. Off.
It was very, very smooth. Both the captain number 5 and first officers were quite seasoned.
911, runway 06, 050 and 9 are clear. Take off.
Clear for takeoff, Dynasty 611. Takeoff.
Check.
E1. Rotate.
Left 5. 1, 2. Okay, let them off.
Investigators listen to more than conversations. They also want to hear if the plane itself was making any unusual sounds.
Noises on the cockpit voice recorder can either be audible spoken words that are recorded by a microphone, or they can be structural discrepancies that are picked up by the microphone.
If anything, though, this cockpit is unusually quiet. The captain seems relaxed. The microphones pick up the sound of controllers talking to other planes. In the moments before the disaster, nothing seems wrong. There are no unusual sounds. The final words spoken in the cockpit are from Captain Yi Ching Feng.
2,000.
He calls out the distance to their cruising altitude. That's followed by the sound of a chime,
Ой, слышно.
alerting the crew that they're nearing 35,000 feet. And then the cockpit microphone picks up the sound of the plane. Half a second later, the recording stops.
The voice recorder indicated that the conversation of the cockpit crew were totally normal and all of a sudden
The recorders told us that something happened, but it wasn't enough to tell us exactly what it was yet. Many things had been ruled out by then, but we didn't have the golden nugget. We didn't have the real piece of evidence that told us what initiated the breakup of this 747.
After the disappointment of the voice recorder, studying the wreckage becomes the only option for investigators. They focus their efforts on items that can either prove or disprove the link to TWA Flight 800.
So we played a lot of focus on the wreckage observation and examination of every single field.
On July the 12th, 48 days after the crash. Success.
That's definitely such a good take. Okay, let's mark that. Let's bring that up.
The sea of the wreckage piling up at the pier. Investigators study it closely for any evidence that it exploded. If it did explode like the TWA tank, it would be curled and twisted. And the metal would be bent outwards. But this fuel tank is different.
And we found the central fuel tank was relatively intact.
And it's crumpled inwards. Unlike the tank for the TWA flight, there's no soot. There would be if the jet fuel inside had ignited.
So at that time, we pretty much ruled out the cause of the fuel tank.
The wreckage recovered so far has also forced investigators to abandon another theory, that a bomb brought down the plane.
None of the wreckage showed any evidence of sooting, any kind of explosive damage.
The China Airlines crash was neither a repeat of TWA Flight 800, nor a deliberate bombing. Investigators are running out of leads. As more wreckage is identified and recovered, investigators find an intriguing clue. It's discovered when they examine a series of small vents from Flight 611. All commercial jetliners have dozens of these vents near the floor. They're essentially pressure release valves. They're called dado panels. There's only one reason.
Еще одна.
If the
Вкусная, которая.
passengers were to suddenly decompress,
Да, там еще одна-то есть.
so much force on the floor that it could collapse and damage vital flight controls. That's precisely what happened to a Turkish Airlines flight in 1974.
Вторая уже.
The pilots couldn't control their plane after their
Толпа, блин, вали. Что там мешает?
If the floor on that flight had collapsed, the
Да так
pilots
это
would
что,
be able
ладно.
to save the plane.
Опять перед ним мешает.
After that accident, the NTSB recommended that manufacturers install many more relief vents between a passenger plane's upper and lower levels. If there is decompression in the cargo area, the dado panels open automatically and release the pressure on the floor. There were 65 dado panels on the China Airlines flight. 19 of them were recovered from the ocean. 4 recovered panels were in the open position. It tells investigators that there must have been a sudden loss of pressure beneath the passenger cabin. But it doesn't tell them what caused it. The dado panels lead investigators closer to solving the mystery of this crash. But it's just a small piece of a much bigger puzzle. There are hundreds of
Что-то
pieces of
должен
wreckage to examine.
серьезно.
Kate
не мешает.
wonders if a few of those pieces might be able to tell him where the decompression originated.
I've been reading about the trajectory analysis data on Flight 800.
Сядем-то вообще.
I'd like to try it.
The Ballistic trajectory analysis is a technique that US investigators used to figure out how TWA Flight 800 disintegrated. It's impossible to do without specialized computers.
We figure that because it disintegrated there, the ballistic analysis which the NTSB did in TWA would be very, very useful to us, to help us to analyze the trajectory of the flying debris.
The analysis is based on a simple plan. The pieces that came off the plane first would be the first to hit the water. If investigators can figure out which pieces those were, they'll know where the trouble began. Radar that had been tracking the plane as it climbed also ended up tracking pieces of debris as they fell. The salvage workers have recorded the precise location of those same pieces of wreckage. Their logs could match a specific piece to its radar track. Investigators know the wind speed on the day of the crash, and they can obtain precise information about ocean currents.
Да, вторая уже, две кухни уже.
The last piece of the puzzle comes from the plane's flight data recorder. The plane's altitude, speed, and direction at the time of the breakup. As they're brought to the dock, every single piece of wreckage has been logged and numbered for identification.
Ой.
K. Young selects 18 pieces of wreckage for the computer analysis. Some from the front, some from the middle, and some from the back of the plane. Along with all the other data, he'll feed information about each item's weight and shape into the computer.
526.
Based on where the pieces fell, the computer should be able to calculate which of those 18 pieces was the first to come off the plane.
Не знаю, к нам, я имею в виду.
Each one of those items is separate from the other.
Сколько мне Юля уже? Я не знаю. Вообще никаких проблем не знаю.
K. Young gets to see how Flight 611 broke from beginning to end. Along with the dado clouds, it's a very important clue.
Уже спаться уже надо. Закрасить надо. Красным было еще.
Investigators are now keen to recover items from the rear of the plane.
Мама, уж скинем думаю будет.
Hundreds of pieces of wreckage are piling up at the pier on the Penghu Islands. The NTSB sends metallurgist Frank Zakar to Taiwan to examine the wreckage.
Еще один душ. Кухонь две. Не две, три, по-моему. Там еще одну, по-моему. Ну и дом. Не одну кухню, три. Вот это дом попался. В одном доме три кухни. Жесть. Ой. Понятно. Ребят, там я скоро, просто скоро в кино. Кого? Я знаю. Подписчики есть. Ну, не знаю. Завтра уже, наверное. Все. Хорошо? Да, завтра.